We're going to move on now to our next item of business, which is a debate on motion 19743 in the name of Michael Russell on the Referendums Scotland Bill at stage 1. And could I invite all members who wish to contribute to this debate to press their request to speak buttons as soon as possible. And I call on Michael Russell, the Cabinet Secretary, to open and to move the motion.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And at the outset, I want to thank the Finance and Constitution Committee and the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee for their consideration of this bill. I want to thank their conveners, Graham Simpson and Bruce Crawford, for their unfailing courtesy, and their members for the positive nature of the discussion that we had. We had a good debate in both committees about this bill, and I hope that tone will mark today's debate from all of us. And I'm not looking at Graham Simpson in particular, but if the cap fits, no doubt he will wear it. The Scottish Government will provide a positive... It would be, I think if I could just be allowed to make a little progress beyond the first paragraph, that would be helpful. The Scottish Government will provide a positive response to the committee before the start of stage 2. And I want to make it clear that what I am seeking is the maximum and widest possible support for this bill. And in what I say today, I hope I will indicate how open I am to changes and developments in the bill. Absolutely.
Adam Tompkins.
I'm very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. In his opening remarks, the Minister talked about the courtesy of the Finance Committee and the Delegated Powers Committee. Has the Government matched that courtesy by publishing its responses to those committees' reports?
Well, I'm sorry that he did not listen to the paragraph that I've just read, because it gave the answer to his question. The Scottish Government will provide a positive response to the committee before the start of stage 2, and it will be a positive response. The purpose of the bill is to put in place a standing framework of conduct and campaign rules that could be applied to any national referendum in Scotland. My intention is that these rules meet the highest standards of electoral administration and regulation and reflect international best practice. This will ensure that the debate on a future referendum concentrates on the merit of the issue, not the process. There is existing legislation that sets out the rules and approaches to referendum held in Scotland, but there is no such Scottish legislation, and this bill therefore addresses a specific gap in the devolved legislative landscape, which is important considering that we are responsible for our own franchise. Now, I'm pleased that the committee has recognised the importance of this work and has supported unanimously the policy intention of the bill. I am sure that the Westminster maxim will therefore be followed, that the vote follows the voice, and vice versa. As with all elections, the needs of voters should be at the heart of our considerations. By establishing a consistent set of rules and aligning with these familiar to voters from other polls will ensure that it is as easy as possible for voters to participate. As I indicated when I gave evidence to the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee and the Finance and Constitution Committee, I am always open to alternative approaches to any aspects of any bill for which I am responsible, where these would more effectively facilitate the policy aims. I therefore welcome the suggestions made by the committee on ways to improve the bill. The committee has recommended that the bill be changed to mandate that referenda on constitutional matters must be taken forward by primary legislation, that other referendums should normally require primary legislation. I'm happy to accept the committee's recommendation that changes should be made to section 1 of the bill. I agree that normally a short bill should be the way to trigger a referendum, and for the avoidance of doubt, I can confirm that any proposal for example for a Scottish independence referendum should now require a short bill. I will also reflect seriously on the second question the committee poses for me, whether it's appropriate for some less contentious referendums to be triggered by secondary legislation, and I will bring forward further details of my approach before the start of stage 2. One of the matters that would be set by the trigger legislation is the regulated campaign period for the poll, also referred to as the referendum period. The committee heard evidence that suggests a default period should be set. I've always been open to setting a default campaign period. I'm convinced by the evidence put forward it's in the interest of voters that it should happen, and it should be 10 weeks. I intend, therefore, to move an amendment at stage 2 to set this default. Voter information and engagement before and during any referendum campaign is an important matter, Presiding Officer, as is the scope of restrictions on publications in the days leading to the poll, of which, of course, this Parliament is presently suffering. The Scottish Government works in close partnership with other agencies such as Education Scotland to ensure that young voters receive appropriate education in citizenship and political literacy. Electoral stakeholders also undertake specific work to engage with young voters on matters of registration. There is a clear role for specific organisations to provide information during the run-up to the poll. We will therefore make changes to the provisions on pre-poll publication restrictions to ensure that the Scottish Parliament corporate body can continue its business as usual and to allow electoral registration officers continue to their work on promoting voter registration. The committee has also made a number of recommendations on the conduct of polls. I greatly value the expertise of electoral administrators and the Electoral Commission in delivering elections and referendums. We will give careful consideration to the recommendations made by the Commission and by other stakeholders on possible refinements to the conduct rules. I can confirm that I will bring forward amendments on a number of technical issues, such as to require the Chief Counting Officer to consult with the Electoral Commission when issuing directions, and I want to reiterate my strong intention that administrators should have the appropriate time and resources to undertake their duties to the highest standard. We've already made clear that the Scottish Government will fund the necessary arrangements for a referendum held under the framework. We've reflected on the feedback from stakeholders. We've already made specific provision in the bill to account for areas of additional cost, such as any additional registration costs which may fall on electoral registration officers. My officials will continue to work with administrators during the implementation of the bill to ensure that they do receive all the support they need to deliver any future poll and which has been promised. I also intend to work with the SPCB and the Electoral Commission to ensure that the funding arrangements in the bill are acceptable and align with the conversation this Parliament is due to have on the electoral reform bill over the coming months. I'll also respond positively in due course to the committee's recommendation requesting additional information on the costs set out in the financial memorandum. Presiding Officer, I now want to turn to the recommendations concerning the campaign rules. It's imperative that any electoral event is properly regulated. The experience, of course.
Neil Findlay.
Just before the Minister moves on, I wonder if he could set out where he foresees what type of, or examples he can give us of other referenda that might happen. So what type of issues might be covered?
Well, a number of examples were used, of course, during the discussion on this matter in the committee of which he is a member, the Delegated Powers Committee, and if you'd allow me to finish, Mr. Findlay, and also laid out in the discussion that took place at the committee, the Finance and Constitution Committee. There are a range of issues, for example, arising possibly out of work of the Citizens' Assembly, which is what happened in Ireland, which could be considered. I am not going to go through a list of possibilities, but clearly those possibilities were discussed and could continue to be discussed. And a man of such imagination as Mr. Findlay and Mr. Tompkins, who has now risen, and Mr. Rumbles, all will have proposals. I have no idea. I welcome hearing those proposals.
Mr. Tompkins.
And thank you to the Cabinet Secretary giving way. In response to his question from Mr. Findlay, the Cabinet Secretary talked about referendum proposals from the Citizens' Assembly. So why is there then no provision in this bill for anything relating to a citizen initiative, a citizen-initiated referendum?
Cabinet Secretary.
Because they have made no such proposals and are only just underway. But were they to make those proposals, they could be fed in. Were they to make such proposals, they could be fed in through government or by other means. And remember, the Citizens' Assembly presiding officer is reporting to this Parliament and this government. So there is a route for that to happen. I take Mr. Rumbles.
Mr. Rumbles, Mike Rumbles.
Cabinet Secretary for giving way. I am not a member of that committee. None of my Liberal Democrat colleagues are a member. So we are unaware of what you have laid out to the committee as other examples. Could you do that for the benefit of the whole chamber?
I said there were discussions. I didn't say I set out examples, but could I commend the wonderful official report of these committees, which I'm sure will contain all the information that he is seeking to have, and I'm sure he will find the time to peruse it. Let me now turn, presiding officer, to the recommendations concerning campaign rules. One of the experience of the 2016 EU referendum demonstrated that campaigning is changing and not always in a way that benefits voters. If we're to provide the space for rational, respectful debate of the type we've just seen demonstrated, we must also change our approach to regulating campaigning. One of the key areas of development is the transparency of online campaign materials. Scotland led the way in 2014 by mandating that online campaign materials needed to have an imprint showing the name and address of the person responsible for the material. That experience of innovating in this area provided valuable information on how to improve the approach. The bill as drafted builds on the experience of 2014 by focusing regulation more closely on material itself. I welcome the committee's support for changes to the imprint rules. I intend to bring forward amendments to make a number of adjustments to these provisions. These adjustments, taken alongside with other changes to the enforcement regime, will give the Electoral Commission additional regulatory tools. It can then focus more closely on monitoring campaign activity. In particular, I intend to remove the reasonably practical exemption for campaign material. This will incentivise online companies to continue to innovate to make sure material can always be clearly identified as campaign material. I've also carefully considered the other recommendations regarding excluding individual opinions from the scope of the provision and intend to bring forward an amendment to exempt personal opinion from the imprint rules and therefore focus the imprint requirement more closely on campaigners. This will ensure that individuals are not deterred from participating. Another key element of a regulatory regime is the penalties that can be applied. When I gave evidence to the Finance and Constitution Committee, I said that I felt a major increase in the maximum civil fine was required. I now intend to bring this forward at stage 2 by increasing the maximum fine from £10,000 to £500,000, which I think indicates the seriousness with which this is taken. This will significantly strengthen the powers of the Commission and acts as a deterrent to breaches of the rules. I also intend to accept other recommendations made by the Commission to change the procedure for some of the offences in the bill. Taken together, these changes will help to deter those who may consider breaking the rules, ensure that those who do break the rules are suitably sanctioned. Experience, of course, in the 2014 Scottish referendum was positive, but it was not so in the UK-EU referendum in 2016. Now, Presiding Officer, the Electoral Commission has also made a number of recommendations on donations, including the frequency of reporting and on assets held. From discussions held with the Commission, I understand, however, that further work needs to be undertaken before the Commission will be able to recommend a specific set of measures. We'll continue to work with the Commission on these matters and look forward to developing further refinements when appropriate. With that in mind, I'm heartened to see that the committee supports the objective of ensuring that the bill can remain a dynamic framework that can be responsive to changes in campaigning and electoral administration. This provision addresses a specific concern of the electoral community. I accept the recommendation of the committee to consider how to narrow the breadth of this delegated power, however, and I'll bring forward a suitable amendment at stage 2. Finally, Presiding Officer, let me turn to the one area where the committee and I have had a difference of opinion. We all believe that all questions should be tested before use. That was the case in the only referendum for which this Parliament has so far taken responsibility, and the process resulted in the changing of the proposed question for the 2014 independence referendum. That question was not only used on the 18th of September 2014, but it's been used since in 58 opinion polls over the past 5 years. Polling evidence from Progress Scotland shows that the question is well recognised and regarded as fair. Moreover, 77% of respondents in a recent poll said they would be satisfied if it was asked again, and only 10% disagreed. However, I do think questions will go out of use and require to be altered as time passes. I therefore believe there should be a shelf life for any question which might be the duration of 2 parliaments, and I will move an amendment and I will move an amendment to achieve that at stage 2. Some of those, however, I think members should wait until I have concluded. Some of those who propose testing every question, even if it has been tested before, are doing so, of course, some of them, out of principle. And I respect that. So I entirely accept it's right for me to look at the issue again in the light of these views and the evidence that the committee has received and consider if I should go even further. I'm therefore in agreement with the committee that I should discuss this matter with the Electoral Commission and come back at stage 2 with any proposals that may arise from these discussions. I'm happy to commit myself to do so today in the spirit of trying to reach an agreement that will be acceptable to those who take a positive view of this bill and want it to go forward with the widest support, which I certainly do. No, I'm almost finished. This bill seeks to establish a high-quality set of rules developed specifically for Scotland, which will ensure that the conduct of future referendums is robust, transparent, and in the interests of the voter. Presiding Officer, I thank the committees for their work, and I move that the Parliament agrees to the general principles of the Referendums Scotland Bill.
Thank you, and I call Bruce Crawford as convener of the committee.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, one of the ambitions of Scottish devolution was to create a new politics based on a much more consensual approach rather than the more adversarial style of politics that was seen at Westminster. This was always perhaps just a bit idealistic. But my goodness, do we need more consensual politics at this time, perhaps more so than at any time in my life? I'm therefore glad to say that the Finance and Constitution Committee were able to come to a consensus and produce a unanimous Stage 1 report on the Referendum Scotland Bill. This demonstrates quite clearly that it's still possible for colleagues right across the political spectrum working together to come to constructively and collaboratively to come to a conclusion. Frankly, if you'd asked me at the beginning of the process of our taking evidence I would have been sceptical about whether such an outcome was indeed achievable. I therefore want to warmly thank my colleagues on the committee for the spirit in which they approached our scrutiny of the bill, particularly their collective willingness to reach a consensus based on the evidence. This enlightened approach is very welcome given the voracious cynicism and increasingly public distrust which I believe threatens to undermine our democratic values. The report, I believe, is an excellent example of good scrutiny based on detailed examination of expert evidence. It's also clear to me, as I'm sure it is also clear to the rest of my colleagues on the committee, that this unanimous outcome would not have been possible without the high level of professional input from our clerking team led by James Johnson, nor indeed without the excellent advice provided by our advisor, Alistair Clark. The support I received from the committee vice convener, Adam Tompkins, in the process was also invaluable in achieving the outcome we did. We also very much welcome the spirit in which the report has been received by the Cabinet Secretary and recognise his willingness to consider our findings. And he's already outlined today some of the areas in which the Scottish Government intends to bring forward amendments in a range of areas. Presiding Officer, let me now turn in some detail to our key conclusions and recommendations. The committee supports the policy objectives of the bill to put in place a generic framework for referendums on the basis that the bill is amended to reflect the weight of evidence we received. We note almost all of our witnesses welcomed the proposals for a generic framework as being consistent with international good practice. There are two main areas in the bill which the committee believes need to be considered again by ministers. First, the powers in Section 1 that enable ministers to make regulations under the affirmative statutory instrument procedure to provide for the holding of a referendum. Second, the power in Section 3(7 to allow ministers to specify in subordinate legislation the wording of the question in a referendum without consulting the Electoral Commission if that wording has previously been tested. As far as Section 1 is concerned, the expert opinion we received was somewhat critical of the extent of this power. Indeed, Dr. Alan Rennick, the Deputy Director of the Constitution Unit, told us he could find no well-functioning parliamentary democracy that gives ministers blanket authority to call a referendum by secondary legislation. Dr. Rennick and a number of our other expert witnesses recommended the power should be removed, and we've heard today what the Cabinet Secretary has said in that regard. Therefore, the committee recommends that the bill be amended so that first, referendums on constitutional issues must require primary legislation. Second, all other referendums will ordinarily require primary legislation. And thirdly, if the Cabinet Secretary wishes to identify specific criteria for the other referendums which would not ordinarily require primary legislation, he should lodge the necessary amendments at Stage 2. The committee also explored the matter of question testing in some detail. The key consideration was whether or not a referendum question which had been tested by the Electoral Commission should be retested if it's proposed to be used again in a future referendum. The Cabinet Secretary explained to us that while he was in favour of question testing, he was not in favour of confusing people. I don't think many of us are. In relation to the possibility of a second independence referendum, his view is that the question used in the referendum in 2014 remains in current use. And to support this view, he cited the use of the wording in many opinion polls. However, the evidence the committee received mainly took a different view. In particular, the committee noted the evidence from the Electoral Commission. They told us they strongly believe that they should be asked to test a question, even when that question has been asked before. In their view, this is because contexts can change. They argue that a formal testing process provides assurance to the voter about the integrity of the referendum. The committee therefore recommended that the Cabinet Secretary recognise the weight of evidence in favour of the Electoral Commission testing a previously used question. We also recommended that he must come to an agreement with the Electoral Commission based on this evidence prior to stage 2. Now, the committee also examined in some detail a number of other technical aspects of the bill, and this includes the regulation of digital campaign material, again referred to by the Cabinet Secretary in his contribution, in particular the provision of imprints on such material. We recommended that the bill could be amended to tighten the requirements for providing imprints on digital material. We also recommended that ministers could provide some clarification of the intended scope of the bill in this area. On timing issues, we agreed with our witnesses that adequate time is required in advance of polling day for two key purposes. First, to allow sufficient time for the campaign so that voters have sufficient opportunity to be properly informed about the issues. Second, to allow administrators and regulators enough time to prepare for any referendum. We recommended that the bill is amended to include a minimum period of 10 weeks for the regulated referendum period. On thresholds, we did not consider that there was sufficient evidence to support anything other than a simple majority. Finally, the committee looked closely at section 37 of the bill. This section provides ministers with the power to modify the Act by regulations. Some of our witnesses expressed concern that the modification power is very wide. The Cabinet Secretary explained that the extent of the power is to provide, as he used the term today already, for dynamic legislation and to ensure that electoral legislation is not static. The committee supports this objective, particularly given the need to respond to the increasing influence of electoral campaigning via social media. But we also recognised the concerns of witnesses that the power is very wide. We therefore recommend that the Cabinet Secretary lodges at stage 2 amendments which provide the necessary assurances that, in his words, the section 37 power is not able to be used for backdoor amending. Presiding Officer, it's refreshing that during a period when our politics has become increasingly volatile, our committee system can still deliver robust, constructive and consensual scrutiny of the executive. And that's a credit both to my colleagues on the committee and the wider political culture here at Holyrood. The recommendations in our Stage 1 report were intentionally drafted to inform an open discussion on how the bill can be improved. So finally, we welcome the willingness of the Cabinet Secretary to seriously consider our recommendations. Look forward to discussing the bill further with him at stage 2. In particular, I was encouraged by his comments in regard to the question. This is an issue I know the Cabinet Secretary feels strongly about, but I also know he will try to find an agreement with the Electoral Commission if that is at all possible. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Adam Tompkins to open for the Conservative Party.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Let me open with a quotation. "We have never hidden the fact that I see this bill being used by the Parliament and the Government to create the referendum for independence." Unquote. So said Mike Russell in evidence to this Parliament's Finance and Constitution Committee in September this year. So let there be no doubt. For the SNP, this bill is not about referendums in general. It is about IndyRef 2. This bill was announced by the First Minister in a statement about independence. And there is no issue, as we heard from the Cabinet Secretary earlier this afternoon. There is no issue other than independence which the SNP proposed to put to the people of Scotland in a referendum. This bill is designed with only one purpose in mind: to pave the way for an unwanted second independence referendum. Scottish Conservative MSPs, presiding officer, were elected to this Parliament on a manifesto commitment that was crystal clear. We will oppose the SNP's attempts to steamroller Scotland into an unwanted second independence referendum every step of the way. And for that reason, I'll take an intervention in a minute, and for that reason, we will oppose this unwanted referendums bill at every stage, including in the stage 1 vote this evening. We will vote against this bill. We do not support its general principles. We do not want a second independence referendum. The question of independence was put to the people of Scotland in a referendum in 2014 that Nicola Sturgeon herself described as once in a lifetime. We said no, and we meant it. But even now, Nicola Sturgeon is not listening. Presiding officer, if the general principles of this bill are bad enough, its detail is worse. Not at the moment. Not only are the SNP trying to steamroller us into a second independence referendum, they are trying to rig that referendum by playing fast and loose with its rules. Let's start with section 1, which says this: the Scottish ministers may, by regulations, provide for a referendum to be held throughout Scotland. This is an astonishing provision, which I note the Finance and Constitution Committee has unanimously recommended must be amended. There is no equivalent power in the UK's standing legislation on referendums. No referendum can be held in the United Kingdom without the authority of an Act of Parliament, the highest source of law we have. Yet here, Mike Russell wants to give himself the power by a click of his ministerial fingers to hold a referendum by order. Alan Rennick of the Constitution Unit at University College London told the Finance Committee that he knows of no well-functioning parliamentary democracy in the world that gives ministers blanket authority to call a referendum in this way. And the Institute for Government agree. Section 1 should be removed from the bill, they have said. Primary legislation should provide the basis of any future referendum in Scotland. This is so obviously right, presiding officer, that it really should not need saying. Referendums decide things. They are not expressions of opinion. They are formal devices for making decisions. Scotland decided not to become independent of the rest of the United Kingdom in 2014. And the United Kingdom decided to leave the European Union in 2016, in a few moments. These are big decisions. And the process for making them demands the fullest scrutiny. And that is why passing an act, rather than Mr. Russell clicking his fingers, should be a mandatory requirement for any referendum. Referendums, Mr. Russell, I'll give way in 1 second. Referendums, Mr. Russell, are about enhancing democracy. They are not about augmenting ministerial powers to rule by diktat. Section 1 of your bill is badly misconceived and it should be removed from the legislation.
Cabinet Secretary Michael
Surprising that the member who's a professor of constitutional law does not know that secondary legislation isn't about clicking fingers, but let that pass. How does it enhance democracy to make sure that the people of Scotland are not heard when they vote not to leave the EU?
Alan Tompkins.
How does it enhance democracy for this Parliament not to be allowed to debate whether there should be any future referendum, Mr. Russell? That's the question in front of us today. Presiding officer, I want to move on to the role of the Electoral Commission. Presiding officer, it has become a much valued, widely respected and absolutely core aspect of referendums in the United Kingdom that a proposed referendum question must be tested for its intelligibility by the Independent Electoral Commission. Referendum questions are proposed by ministers, tested by the Electoral Commission, and then ultimately set by Parliament. Yet Section 3(7) of this bill, a provision every bit as egregious as Section 1, would allow Scottish ministers to bypass altogether the Electoral Commission's role in question setting in the event that a proposed referendum question has been tested at some point in the past. Now, I can find nobody other than Mike Russell who thinks this is anything other than a terrible idea. The Electoral Commission itself was robust in the evidence it supplied to the Finance and Constitution Committee. The Electoral Commission must be required to assess any referendum question proposed in legislation, regardless of whether the Commission has previously published views on the question proposed. That's the Electoral Commission's view, Presiding Officer, and it's absolutely correct. It was supported by all of the witnesses the Finance and Constitution Committee heard from, including the Constitution Unit, the Institute for Government and the Law Society of Scotland. Referendums require the fullest public confidence if their results are to be respected. And the Electoral Commission's expert and independent testing of the question is key to establishing and maintaining that confidence. It should never be bypassed. Ministers have given no good reason for wanting to oust the jurisdiction of the Electoral Commission. This is nothing other than another ill-conceived power grab by a minister desperate for IndyRef 2 and desperate to ensure that his side can campaign under flags and banners for yes, as Nicola Sturgeon did in George Square at the weekend and as they all did in 2014. Presiding Officer, we need to learn from the experience of previously held referendums. We know much more about referendums, about referendum campaigns, and about the impact of referendum results than we did before the 2014 and the 2016 constitutional referendums that have so left their mark on Scottish and British politics. It is vital that the Electoral Commission is not merely permitted, but is required by law to assess all referendum questions, whether novel or recycled, in order that we learn all appropriate lessons from past experience. The Electoral Commission's full role must be restored, and the Minister's attempts to bypass it in section 3.7 must be removed from this legislation. Presiding Officer, in legislating for electoral events, whether elections or referendums, the paramount principle is surely to put the interests of voters first. This bill fails that test. The Institute for Government have said this. It is imperative, they've said, that the Scottish Government avoid the perception that it is seeking to avoid full scrutiny of any future referendum proposal by intention or as a consequence of a desire to fast-track the process. I hope the Minister is listening and takes heed of this advice. Seeking to sideline the independent expertise of the Electoral Commission is not a good look, and the Minister should change course while he still can. As it stands, Presiding Officer, this is a bad bill. It seeks to pave the way for a second independence referendum that Scotland does not want, in clear breach of the promises to the Scottish people that Nicola Sturgeon made when campaigning in 2014. And this is a bad bill, Presiding Officer, because it purports to give to Scottish ministers powers that no government minister should have in a well-functioning democracy, and frankly, powers that no minister who respects the democratic process should want. This bill seeks not only to hold an unwanted second independence referendum, it seeks to rig the rules of that referendum. And to both of those propositions, Presiding Officer, we on these benches say no thanks. For all these reasons, Scottish Conservatives will be voting against this bill at decision time tonight.
Thank you. And I call on Alex Rowley to open for the Labour Party.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In opening for Labour today, I want to acknowledge the work of the Finance and Constitution Committee in holding evidence sessions and producing the report for the Stage 1 debate. The committee supported the policy objective of the bill, and if we as a country wanted to move more and more to a direct democracy where referenda was used more and more in decision-making, then the objectives set out in the bill would be sound. That is not to say the bill as it currently stands is sound, but the committee did make a number of key recommendations on how to improve some of the fundamental flaws that are currently part of the bill. But the first issue I would want to raise, indeed the main issue I would want to raise, is to question whether there is a need for this bill. Are we moving in a direction that is going to see the people of Scotland being engaged in more referendums? Are the people of Scotland at this time demanding more referendums? They do want Brexit fixed, and if a people's vote gives us the opportunity to move on that, then yes. But I have to say my experience is that the people of Scotland are sick, fed up of constitutional conflict. I am not sure that in Scotland at this time there is a demand for a referendum bill, and certainly not until the current constitutional crisis created by the Tories and made even worse by the Tories is resolved. Yeah.
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful to the member for giving way. Clearly he has concerns and disagrees with those of us who support independence about the idea of more constitutional referendums. But were there any of the witnesses who gave us expert evidence on the democratic process, on referendums, or indeed the Electoral Commission, who said that the principle of a framework bill for referendums was a bad idea in itself? I seem to recall they all supported it.
Alex Rowley.
Well, I think I'm coming on to that, and I will address Mr Harvey's point. The SNP, on the one hand, have tried to portray this bill, just as Mr Harvey does, as simply being an administrative procedure to facilitate future referendums, as opposed to the ad hoc approach that's in place at the present time. But of course, this bill is only really about one referendum. And in fairness, the SNP have made no secret of that. This is the SNP IndyRef2 bill. As Nicola Sturgeon has made clear, this bill is being put into place to pave the way for another independence referendum within the lifetime of this Parliament. Labour cannot support this bill on that basis. We believe it is not in Scotland's interest, in the midst of the Tory Brexit chaos, to create even more uncertainty and even more chaos. Indeed, I would suggest it would be impossible during this chaos to put a clear proposition to the Scottish people. Would we be in Europe? Would we be out of Europe? Mr Russell suggests he has had a nod and a wink from some in Europe that we would be welcomed with open arms. I'm not sure who nodded. Yeah.
Cabinet Secretary Michael
To be
Russell.
entirely fair, I'd draw your attention to the reported remarks, not nods and winks, but the reported remarks from Herr Van Rompuy, former President of the Commission, who made it clear that he did not regard himself, he said that, as a separatist, but there was a path open if Scotland took it in a usual, conventional, constitutional way. That's nods and winks. That's a path open.
Alex Rowley.
I think, if anything, which we've seen for the failed attempts by the Tories over 3 years, is that it would not be as simple and as straightforward as that. And Mr Russell needs to acknowledge that. But Mr Russell was quoted as saying the relationship between the rest of the UK and the border between Scotland and England will be governed by the European Union in the event of an independent Scotland. Nicola Sturgeon rightly raises concern over the £14 billion trade that we have with the European Union being put at risk from a failed Tory Brexit. But what about the £50 billion of trade we have with the rest of the United Kingdom? This is the inherent contradiction in the SNP ideology. How can it be possible that it would be a disaster for Scotland to leave the single market of the European Union, but it is somehow a triumph to leave an even larger single market, which is the United Kingdom, where the majority of our trade takes place? I will give way. Yeah.
I do not know anybody who has suggested leaving the single market of the United Kingdom. What has been talked about, and you referred to Nicola Sturgeon's remarks, was making sure that that provision was part of the arrangement between the EU and the rest of the UK, because that's what it would be, and the rest of the UK has indicated it wished a seamless trading relationship. So, therefore, no problem.
Alex
I think, you know, the the rest of the United Kingdom is worth £50 billion. If we end up with a hard border between Scotland and England, and I just quoted us, I read it this morning for an article in the Scotsman where Mr Russell said that it would be down to the governance of the European Union to how that border or hard border would work. How can we in this Parliament argue that a hard border in Ireland is a bad thing, but a hard border between Scotland and England is a price worth paying? The answer is we can't. So I say today the majority don't want never-ending constitutional division and chaos, that this bill is not required at this time when we have gone through years of failed Tory austerity, where our public services are buckling under the failures of both Westminster and Edinburgh governments, and people are struggling on a daily basis just to get by. People are crying out for change. That change will not be delivered by simply putting up a border and changing a flag. Indeed, the SNP's Growth Commission demonstrates that independence cannot deliver fundamental change that Scotland needs in our economy and in our society. There is no indication that the SNP-led independent Scotland would avoid damage inflicted by neoliberal economic policies. In fact, the SNP Growth Commission acknowledges that an independent Scotland would be shaped by foreign direct investment, low taxation and prolonged and intensified austerity on stilts. Neither the status quo nor the nationalist proposals can provide what Scotland needs. Labour's approach, Labour's alternative for the future of our country is one where our economy and our society is transformed for the better and for the many. A future where real change has a real impact on making people's lives better. We will invest on the scale that is necessary. We will invest in a scale that has never been seen before and deliver the necessary shift in the balance of power and wealth we need to make our country fairer. That means £250 billion of investment across the whole of the UK over the next 10 years as part of our Green Transformation Fund. £150 billion over the first 5 years of a Labour government as part of our Social Transformation Fund.
Mr. Rowley, I think that what's happened is you've moved from the referendums bill into election campaigning. It sounds like you're reading out the election manifesto of the Labour Party. I would just ask you to get back to the referendums bill.
Well, Presiding Officer, I would have to say that what we have is a referendum bill that the First Minister, that the Cabinet Minister responsible have said time and time again is a bill to pave the way for independence for Scotland. I'm simply trying to contrast what they're proposing for Scotland against what this party sitting here is proposing for Scotland. And we are proposing transformation, a transformational change in the way our economy, in the way our society works, and the type of investment that I'm setting out here. The Growth Commission, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance is sitting, having a wee chuckle to himself there. The Growth Commission, which Derek Mackay sat on, has made clear that we would have more austerity, decades more austerity as a result of this independence referendum bill that we have in front of us today. So, Presiding Officer, to conclude, rather than trying to rig a referendum, this government here in Edinburgh should bring a halt to this legislation and free up the time to allow this Parliament to focus on the kind of transformation our country needs. This bill is flawed. Vote it down.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Patrick Harvey to open for the Green Party.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And while it's always great fun to debate borders, flags or the Growth Commission, I'm afraid I've come here to debate a framework bill on referendums, because I do value the work that my colleagues and I on the Finance and Constitution Committee have done taking evidence on that bill. And I think the evidence on the basic principle that there should be framework legislation for referendums, the evidence there is pretty clear. I can't remember hearing a substantial case against it from all of the evidence that we've sought. But there are clearly changes that will be required to this bill, and I think the Cabinet Secretary has acknowledged that. I have struggled to understand the case, for example, that a question can be so urgent that primary legislation can't be used and secondary legislation should be used, and yet the same question not so important that scrutiny can be dispensed with. So I and the committee's report, I'm not saying never to the idea of secondary legislation, but the Scottish Government needs to be far clearer about the principles involved and in what circumstances it thinks that should be justified. On question testing, a case can be made as well for a shelf life, but it's not an overwhelming case. And if there is time to conduct question testing in preparation for any particular referendum, then I struggle to see why that testing should be dispensed with. We do have to acknowledge the importance and the legitimacy of an independent body that can advise on democratic processes. And either we trust the Electoral Commission to be that body or we don't. A case might be made for Scotland creating a new independent body to take on those functions. In particular, I'm unclear why only those political parties that have 2 MPs at Westminster should be able to nominate commissioners to the Electoral Commission. I have no idea why a DUP commissioner should have any say in issues reflecting Scottish democracy. But there is no case for saying that we will use the Electoral Commission as that independent body, but only if we think it will make decisions we agree with. And the context here is clearly about NDREF 2 and the fear that some people would seek to muddy the waters by reframing that debate when it comes using terms that have never been used in relation to independence, but which are solely defined around Brexit. People have mischievously suggested, I think, reframing that debate around Leave and Remain. Leave, Vote Leave, and Leave.eu are established, distinct political brands which come preloaded with their political values. Both organisations and Leave as a political brand are permanently associated with their track record of anti-European attitudes, hostility to immigration and serious breaches of electoral law. And while in this chamber we are not allowed to accuse anyone of lying, both organisations have made countless statements which strain my ability to find a kinder description. Remain is also strongly associated with the question of EU membership, with freedom of movement, with a single market, and not all supporters of independence agree with those positions. So the purpose of the Electoral Commission's testing is to develop clear advice on intelligibility, and it seems to me overwhelmingly clear that any proposal to reframe independence around Leave and Remain would be rejected by any fair assessment.
Neil Findlay.
Mr Harvey rightly lays in to the mistruths said by the Leave campaign, but I have to ask him to reflect on some of the utter rubbish that was in the white paper that was presented at the independence campaign. Would you reflect on that as well?
I have reflected on many occasions as to why I didn't support the SNP's white paper, and on another occasion we'll debate that in detail. I do urge the Scottish Government, though, to have confidence in the Electoral Commission's process for testing, or if he doesn't have confidence, to propose an alternative. I'm glad that the door, from the Scottish Government's point of view, doesn't appear now to be closed in relation to the issue of testing, and I do think we need to hear more before stage 2. There are many other issues that I want to touch on in the brief time available. The lessons that we need to learn from 2014, 2016 and more. The issues around political interference, around dark money, around political education that needs to be so much stronger. the Scottish Parliament now has responsibility for our democratic processes, and the integrity of our democracy is clearly under threat. We need to be making sure that we're passing legislation that is up to addressing that threat and minimising it. In particular, two issues from the Representation of the People Act 1983 need to be addressed. Digital campaigning is now a core part of the electoral process. And under that 1983 legislation, for publications, the Act is clear. Criminal offences arise when publications don't include required information, so that people know the source of what they're looking at. And that doesn't just apply to candidates or parties, it applies to everyone. Publishing online, including via social media, is not just like chatter around the water cooler. It is a core campaign tool. It deserves the same level of regulation. And finally, Presiding Officer, the committee didn't recommend either the Electoral Commission or a new body to rule on the question of providing objective information. But misleading information is far more powerful in this digital age when rumours or deliberate misrepresentation can go viral and become unchallengeable very quickly. So the aspects in the 83 legislation which propose criminal offences in relation to misrepresenting the character of an election candidate, we need to find a way to translate that principle into a relationship to referendums, so that the requirements for honesty, not just from campaign bodies, politicians and activists, but on everybody, are applied in the same way in relation to referendums as we expect them and hope them to be in relation to elections.
Thank you very much, Mr Harvey. And I call on Mike Rumbles, please, Mr Rumbles.
This is a bill that the people of Scotland do not want. But it is a fact that the two nationalist parties in this chamber have the votes to push this fraud of a bill through at decision time. The Scottish Government have wasted a huge amount of time and resources in bringing this 163-page bill forward. Of course, it's the Scottish Government's right to waste taxpayers' money on this bill if it wishes to. But it will face electoral consequences for doing it. It will face these consequences sooner rather than later, because everyone knows that the First Minister has framed IndyRef 2 now as her #1 priority. And what the Cabinet Secretary just made obvious in the debate when he opened and when he took the interventions, and I thank him again for that, is that they haven't got any other examples at all other than IndyRef 2 that this bill is relevant to. So that gives the game away for a start. Exactly what happened to the fact that the First Minister's declared that education was supposed to be the government's #1 priority? Indeed, no. Indeed, Nicola Sturgeon asked us to judge her government on its performance on Scottish education. Well, is it no wonder that the First Minister wants to focus now on IndyRef 2 rather than the state of Scottish education? The First Minister has made it clear that before the end of the year, she will ask whoever is Prime Minister to authorise another divisive referendum in order to break up our country. This is just 5 years after the UK and Scottish government said in the Edinburgh Agreement that they would honour the result of the 2014 referendum. Now, I don't expect the two nationalist parties in this chamber to ever give up on their nationalist aims to break up Britain. Of course I don't. But I did expect that the Scottish Government's commitment to uphold the 2014 result would last, to quote the First Minister at the time, a certain Alex Salmond, remember him, for a generation. At least our current First Minister is clear. She wishes to tear up the Edinburgh Agreement and focus everything on her ambition to break up Britain, and this referendums bill is the first step along this legislative route. Now, she was warned about the implications of this by the head of the civil service in Scotland. We have the Herald to thank for publicising the fact that the Permanent Secretary said that there would be wider implications for the government's business, and that she was also told that constitutional change would mean the deprioritisation of activity. In other words, it would have direct implications for getting on with the day job of running Scotland properly. Now, the Scottish Government has seen fit to ignore, briefly,
Graham Simpson.
It's on that point. I wonder I wonder if...
I think Mr Simpson would like to say something, although you're cheering him on. Mr Simpson?
I often get cheered on by the Cabinet Secretary. Would Mr Rumbles agree with me that ramming through this bill by the end of this year would not make for good legislation, which is what the government wants to do?
I quite agree, and this is an example of bad legislation, and this is an example of what really this Parliament was not designed to do, just ram it through regardless. Now, the Scottish Government, as I say, ignored that advice. Now, can you give me a minute to make some progress? Because I will give way to the Cabinet Secretary in a moment. I have to thank the First Minister for being so unusually clear in what she wants to do. There can also be no doubt that if they examine the detail of this bill, that the SNP administration will use any device to try and maximise their support by any means, fair or foul. I, of course, refer to paragraph 3, subsection 7 of the bill, which so clearly states that the Electoral Commission need not bother to examine the veracity of the proposed referendum question if they've previously done so. So the message from the Scottish Government is clear. We don't want the Electoral Commission to interfere with our question. It gives us a fine advantage as it is, thank you very much, fair means or foul. And on that note, I give way to the Cabinet Secretary.
Cabinet Secretary.
As the member will be aware, I made an opening statement. You intervened in it. And I made it clear that I had proposals on this area and I accepted the recommendations of the committee. So I would have thought I would be commended. Can I also say that I'm very surprised that the convener of the Delegated Powers Committee uses the word rammed when he knows the procedures for bills in this Parliament, and this is forming a normal procedure for this Parliament. I think that's highly surprising.
Mr Rumbles.
Thank you. Of course, you know, I noticed the Cabinet Secretary says he will come to an agreement with the Electoral Commission. Not that the Electoral Commission are right. What a measure of the integrity of this Scottish Government that they've even tried to get away with this. Deputy Presiding Officer, I would much rather have been here today to respond to a debate about the Scottish Government's domestic agenda, to deal with the devolved issues that the Scottish Government actually has responsibility for. The Constitution of our country is a responsibility for our other Parliament in Westminster. Our Parliament here at Holyrood is responsible for the important issues that affect people's lives. We're told by the Scottish Government that it hasn't the time or resources to work on the promised crofting bill, which was so unceremoniously dumped. What has delayed the agricultural bill? Why have we not got a bill to ensure that mental health will be treated as well as physical health? Why have we not got a bill to end homelessness? Where is the Good Food Nation bill? I could list so many more areas to address which this Scottish Government has delayed or dropped, and they proceed with this fraud of a bill. Why? Because they value this referendums bill and India Ref 2 above everything else. Presiding Officer, the Liberal Democrats do not want the chaos of breaking up Britain added to the chaos of Brexit we're already facing. We don't support this bill and we will be voting against it at decision time.
Thank you, Mr Rumbles. And now it's the open debate, 6-minute speeches or so. Angela Constance, followed by Alexander Burnett. Ms Constance, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I was representing this Parliament at the Council of Europe's Congress of Regions and Local Government when the Finance and Constitution Committee was in the process of finalising their Stage 1 report. Nonetheless, though, I have no hesitation in associating myself with this report because, as usual, under the stewardship of Bruce Crawford, the committee pursued the art of the possible and consensus wherever possible. And it is a shame that some contributors to today's debate, particularly those that are members of the Finance and Constitution Committee, haven't taken on board Mr Russell's opening remarks or indeed his significant concessions. And the committee convener outlined that the recommendations in the Stage 1 report are intentionally drafted to inform further discussion and debate on how we get the very best referendums legislation. And I believe the committee's report can help us as we go forward to learn from the best of the 2014 referendum experience, but also from the worst of the 2016 experience and the unfolding consequences. And, Presiding Officer, I have never hidden that I've believed in independence since I was 8, and indeed I've waved a few flags in my time. And I've campaigned and indeed marched for independence since I was 18, at a time when it was far from fashionable. And I was also, in 2016, elected on a manifesto commitment that said we believe that the Scottish Parliament should have the right to hold another referendum if there is a significant and material change in the circumstances that prevailed in 2014, such as Scotland being taken out of the EU against our will. And I want our journey towards independence to be built on the highest of international standards. So we can't pick and choose when we apply that gold standard. Therefore, I want any referendum on Scotland's constitutional future to be built on primary legislation, because I fundamentally want this Parliament to decide, and every member of it to have the opportunity and the choice to vote for it or against it. And I have never expected nor demanded neither citizen nor politician to abandon their own deeply held convictions and conscience. We can only seek to persuade, and we can never do so by closing down debate or scrutiny. Ultimately, it should be this Parliament that decides whether or not there is a referendum, the details of that legislation, and what powers to confer or not on ministers. And for the record, I support the bill being amended to include a minimum campaign period. I think that's based on good democratic practice, and I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's commitment to this. The issues of the referendum question and testing were explored robustly by committee. I'm somewhat, I suppose, surprised that there seems to be some concern about conspiracy, when actually there are different views on this issue across the wider Yes movement. And while my own view, in my view, it is entirely logical and legitimate to say that the 2014 question has already been tested by the Electoral Commission, it remains current because it's been asked 200 times since 2014. And, you know, there is nothing stopping the Electoral Commission from publishing and sharing their views in future. But nonetheless, I do accept that it is prudent and that it is mature of committee to say to both the Cabinet Secretary and the Electoral Commission in the first instance to go away, find some space, look at the evidence together and see if you can come to an agreed way forward and come back to us prior to stage 2. And I can support this approach, despite my own grumbles about some aspects of the Electoral Commission as a UK-wide body as it's structured. And I won't repeat the comments that Patrick Harvey made earlier. These were issues that I raised at committee. And the Cabinet Secretary, whilst being characteristically upfront about his own thinking and instincts, has consistently indicated today and during his remarks at committee that he remains open to ongoing discussion. And I was tempted to say that he was being uncharacteristically flexible. But I think that would be unfair, as there are very few people who will have observed the inflexibility of Westminster in recent times who would not see the self-destruction of the UK government's approach and seek to avoid it. The UK government have failed to generate consent and trust from Remainers, and they've even lost support of some of their own. And I think if Brexit has taught us anything, surely it's what not to do if you want to persuade people and what not to do if you want to lead. You have to always reach out, and you have to reach out to those of different opinion. And while we live in uncertain times, I do believe that history will show that ignoring the highest Remain voting part of the UK will lead to the demise of the UK. And I suspect I'm not alone in this thinking, as it may be the reason the UK government at present is running
I was just thinking what an excellent... Pardon, please sit down. I was just thinking an excellent speech, actually speaking to the bill on stage 1, and you're just beginning to drift into electioneering, just easing yourself into it, but nevertheless you're doing it, so stop.
Well, I will take your advice, Presiding Officer, and stop. and just end on the point that in relation to this bill could help us build a future, build a consensus, whatever your views are about Scotland's constitutional future.
Thank you. And you know, I have to remind members we are discussing stage one of a bill, a very technical bill, and it's very useful if members will speak to that in the main. I call now Alexander Burnett to be followed by Tom Arthur. Mr Burnett.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and can I firstly take this opportunity to thank the committee clerks for their considerable efforts in producing this report, and to those who gave evidence to the bill, both written and in person. As ever, their time and effort is much appreciated. Now, like most committee members, during multiple evidence sessions, I focused on a particular theme. And on this bill, my area of focus has been on the role of the Electoral Commission and the testing of any referendum question. And it came as little surprise that there was unanimous agreement amongst those giving evidence. And I hope the Cabinet Secretary has taken this on board and ensures that the bill he is seeking to bring forward meets the level of credibility that I hope he would aspire to. Now, the fact that the Minister is able to set referendum timing and questions by secondary legislation is cause for concern. This is not a party political point, but a democratic one. And would the Cabinet Secretary be happy when the shoe is on the other foot and such important details are at the discretion of a Scottish Conservative Minister? But the truth is that this whole bill is a political point, from the speed it is being rushed through Parliament at the expense of existing responsibilities, to the pretence that it is not a foundation stone for a second independence referendum. And this hypocrisy even sits on the face of the bill. For why would a bill that will only cover devolved issues include a specific clause to approve a previously asked question when that question is a reserved issue? Because the only question asked before is the one on independence, and it is the only one the SNP seeks to legislate against scrutiny. And the scrutiny required is very clear and set out by the Electoral Commission, covers requirements for clear timescales, focus groups, interviews, geographical testing, accessibility, and more. I asked Dame Sue Bruce, the Electoral Commissioner for Scotland, her position on the fact that panels we had taken evidence from had been very clear about the need for testing the referendum question, and the Electoral Commission's role in that, including when the question had been asked before. Her response could not be more clear, and I quote Dame Bruce's response. She strongly believes that the Electoral Commission should be asked to test the question. I refer again to putting the voter at the centre of the process. We think that formal testing of the question helps to provide confidence and assurance to the voter and to the Parliament that is posing the question. And, with regard to the integrity of the process, to establish that the question is clear, transparent, and neutral in its setting. So based on the evidence, it was not surprising that the committee concluded at stage one to recommend that the Cabinet Secretary recognises the weight of evidence above in favour of the Electoral Commission testing a previously used referendum question and must come to an agreement based on this evidence with the Electoral Commission prior to stage two. But we must wait to see if this will actually happen, because in committee, when I asked the Cabinet Secretary repeatedly on his view of testing a referendum question, his response, despite the evidence we had heard, was that the question had already been tested. And when probed on why this was beyond question, he said, "I am not in favour of confusing people. If a question has been used again and again, and it continues to be in use, it would be a serious step to try to throw it out." Now, as an aside, I don't think the Cabinet Secretary has much regard for the intelligence of the electorate if he thinks they would be confused. But I mainly believe it is a grave mistake to simply accept a question because it has been used previously. Because there is also an unfortunate arrogance in the Cabinet Secretary's position. What he is really saying is that he knows best, and that he is afraid to seek and trust the Electoral Commission's endorsement. And arrogance or fear is no way to legislate. And in this case, his rejection of the Electoral Commission and their own wish to be involved demonstrates scant support for the protectors of our democracy. Now, we need to ensure that the question is as fair to the electorate as possible, and as ever, the Scottish Conservatives think it is important that every question is tested and created on an evidence-based approach. All of us are learning on a daily basis, whether it be the Electoral Commission, MSPs, or the electorate. The only person who would appear to have given up on learning, and possibly in line with his own party's education record, is the Cabinet Secretary. Because there are many lessons which need to be reflected in this bill, not least the fact that Scotland wants to move on from repeating referendum. Scotland rejected separation in 2014 and sees this constant constitutional posturing as nothing more than disrespect for their vote. So, Cabinet Secretary, I just say it's never too late to start learning. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Tom Arthur to be followed by Neil Findlay. Mr. Arthur, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak in this debate. I would like to begin by thanking the clerks and my colleagues on both the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee and the Finance and Constitution Committee. And I would like to associate myself with the remarks of Bruce Crawford speaking in his capacity as Chair of the Finance and Constitution Committee. I think the work that both committees undertook was serious, rigorous. I think all members of the committee, of both committees, played an important part, and I believe this legislation will be strengthened as a consequence of that. And I would encourage anyone reading the official report of today's proceedings, watching today's proceedings at home or in the gallery, to look at the committee report and to look at the work of the committees, because where we're hearing a rather partisan and political debate taking place in the chamber, taking place in the shadow of a general election campaign, the work that the committees undertook was serious and it was considered, and I think it reflects the best of this Parliament. And I hope as this debate progresses this afternoon, we see more of that ethos and spirit come into our contributions this afternoon. I welcome this piece of legislation, and I also welcome the response from the Cabinet Secretary, taking cognizance of the recommendations both of the DPLR Committee and the Finance and Constitution Committee. I think the proposal to increase the minimum fine from £10,000 to £500 is welcome. I believe that will command support across the committee. I believe the principle for a 10-week default regulated period is to be welcomed as well. I also welcome the Cabinet Secretary's willingness to consider the use of regulation-making powers as provided for within Section 1 and how these can be more clearly defined. And I welcome the commitment that on certain matters such as a future independence referendum that would be conducted by primary legislation. I think that is a sensible way to approach any future referendum, and what this referendum bill and what our deliberations on it offer us is the opportunity to consider the operational matters and the mechanics of any future referendum in what is as close to possible as a sterile political environment, meaning that any future bill paving the way for a referendum on independence for Scotland can focus primarily on the merits of whether that question should be asked or not, which we all have strong views on. On the issue of question testing, I have a degree of sympathy for all positions that have been expressed this afternoon, and as the committee report makes clear, the committee was unanimous in recognising the weight of evidence submitted. However, I would note that there have been, to my knowledge, 6 national referendums in Scotland. 3 of these have been specific to Scotland, 3 have been part of the UK as a whole. Now, the first 3 of these took place in 1975, 1979 and 1997. 3 referendums over 22 years, 2 on devolution, 1 concerning membership of the European Union. However, in the space of 5 years, we have had 3 referendums. So there is a trend of increasing frequency of referendums. I think they are a useful tool for taking certain decisions which perhaps go beyond what would normally be considered appropriate for MSPs to take. In committee, there was certain examples that were highlighted. I think the possibility of questions being referred from Citizens' Assembly is an idea that requires further investigation. I think in that particular scenario, where questions being referred from Citizens' Assemblies, where there was considerable deliberation, where there had been rather considerable deliberation and much public discussion, that might be a potential occasion when the vehicle of using a statutory instrument may be a more appropriate means of initiating that referendum. However, I would note that in the DPLR Committee report and in the Finance and Constitution Committee report, reference was made to using a super affirmative procedure, and that would, of course, give the opportunity for any aspects of a proposed referendum question in that scenario to be amended and to be discussed in some detail. So I think while it should be the norm that referendum questions are considered via primary legislation, there is a case for, I think, retaining that power to create referendums through secondary legislation. And I think that's something that has to be considered at stage 2. And I look forward to having discussions with committee colleagues on the Finance and Constitution Committee and potentially on the Delegated Power and Law Reform Committee as well. In concluding, Presiding Officer, I would note that the Finance and Constitution Committee was unanimous in supporting the policy objectives of the bill. Now, I appreciate today's vote is on the general principles and some opposition members will feel that they are unable to do so. However, given that there was unanimity on supporting the policy objectives of the bill, I would urge opposition members to abstain to allow the bill to progress to stage 2, where it can be amended and their concerns can be addressed, concerns which the Cabinet Secretary has recognised and is showing a willingness to engage constructively with all members and committees to take forward. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Mr Arthur. I'll call Neil Finlay to be followed by Jenny Goldruth. Mr Finlay, please.
Presiding Officer, there are days when this Parliament inspires me and it motivates me and it delivers for our people. And there are days when this place depresses me, when it navel-gazes, when its focus is on issues that command the energy and attention of the political class and is used for narrow party advantage, but which completely and utterly ignores the plight of the people we are sent here to represent. And I'm afraid this is one of those occasions, because I have to say, Presiding Officer, that in 16 years of elected politics, I have not had a single person, not one, come to me and demand that we put through a framework bill on how we conduct referendums. Not one. But let me set out very clearly what people do come to me about. Let me tell you about the issues affecting my community. And I would bet my last penny that these are the issues filling almost every other member of this Parliament's mailbox and taking up their time at constituency surgeries. My constituents in Stonyburn want to know why they no longer have a GP practice in their village for the first time since the formation of the National Health Service.
Sorry, Mr Finlay. Mr Finlay, please sit down. I know this is difficult for everybody. This is stage 1 of a bill on technical issues. Yes, speak against the bill, absolutely. But I don't want to hear detailed political points being made. Instead of discussing, well, you've made your general points, you think there's more important issues, that's your position, but let's discuss this bill. That's what this debate is about.
Officer, I am going to expand on my argument that I'm putting across. I need to exemplify the points that I'm making, and that's what I am attempting to do. And you'll see where my argument goes if you allow me to make those points.
I'll give you a bit of leeway, but don't stretch it too far.
So my point is, why are my constituents not seeing this Parliament address that issue? Why are my constituents across the Lothian who are trying to find somewhere to live, who cannot access a council house, who cannot afford rising rents, why are they not afforded a citizens' initiative or a referendum on a proposal to address homelessness in this city? I'll bet they would want one.
Tom Arthur.
The member, I'm very grateful to Neil Finlay for giving way. Would he like to see these issues potentially discussed at a future Citizens' Assembly? And if there were to be significant and radical proposals were to come forward, would he like to see them put to the people in a referendum potentially?
Well, I think we're starting to move into a whole different set-up, and that would need very wide discussion, because I'll tell you this, there are other issues, like my constituents from East Calder, who are waiting 54 weeks on orthopaedic operations. They're supposed to have a legal...
No, I'm sorry, Mr Finlay, I've warned you already. You're now going into constituency detail. That is the... Please sit down. Please sit down. I understand your position, but don't abuse it. This is a debate on when you don't agree with the bill, fine. You don't agree with the bill because you think there's other better things to deal with. Yes, you've said that. Now please tackle the report that's before you. Attack that. But don't, I'm not going to listen to details of constituency members. I'll ask you to sit down and stop otherwise.
Well, you can do that. Because I think they want to know where ministers in this Parliament break the law over 100,000 times. Where is the initiative in this Parliament, like we are seeing a new initiative with a referendum, where is the new initiative that comes forward to hold ministers who break the law to account? Where is the initiatives coming forward to address drug deaths in this Parliament? We've not even had a debate, never mind a referendum or a citizens' assembly. None of that. There is no new initiatives to come forward to address one of the biggest crises that we have. And yet we want to create a new bill on referendums for something that may never happen, because we know the only thing they want to happen is for Mr Russell to have his day bringing through a bill that paves the way for an independence referendum. Where is the opportunity for a citizens' initiative or a referendum on the government's failing education policy? Because it's supposed to be the top priority of the government. There is no opportunity for us to hold the government to account via a referendum or a citizens' initiative. The government hasn't had an education debate, as we heard already today, for 2 years. So where is the ability for us to hold the government to account? Prime Presiding Officer, if this bill proceeds, I will look to lay amendments on third or additional options on ballot papers for any future referendum. I will look to lay amendments on different citizens' initiatives, initiatives that will hold the government to account when they break the law 100,000 times. Because I'll tell you this, if all we have is more binary choices on referendums, I'll tell you what we'll create. We'll create a more divided, a more depressing politics. That's what we'll create if all we do is create more binary choices. I adopt a default principle that powers should be devolved to the lowest level unless there's an overwhelming or rational reason not to. And I believe that is a sound principle. And I believe that we can debate each topic that comes forward and deliver that power to the most appropriate level. That's what I believe in. But that debate is for another time. This bill should not deflect us from dealing with the immediate issues facing our people. People who out there are lying in doorways, shivering on the street. And I have to say today, I think people will rightfully be looking at this place and wondering what relevance it has to their lives.
Thank you, Mr Finlay. And I now call Jenny Gilruth to be followed by Graham Simpson. Ms Gilruth, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Talk about depressing politics. I am grateful to have the opportunity to contribute to this afternoon's debate on the Referendum Scotland Bill and to quote the draft legislation and acts of the Scottish Parliament to make provision for the holding of referendums throughout Scotland, to make provision about such referendums and other referendums held under acts of the Scottish Parliament. It is undeniable that the tectonic plates of Scottish politics have shifted somewhat cataclysmically since 2014. So the importance of getting this legislation right cannot be underestimated. There are two key issues contained within the Stage 1 report of the Finance and Constitution Committee, which I would like to focus my remarks on today, namely that of electoral registration and political literacy, with particular reference to Section 4 of the draft bill and Section 28. And Presiding Officer, I declare an interest as a former modern studies teacher and as a development officer for the National Qualifications at Education Scotland, where I contributed to the Curriculum for Excellence briefing paper on political literacy, which was published in August 2013. The UK-wide introduction of individual electoral registration, IER, did not happen until after the 2014 referendum. And as the committee was told, it is widely thought that one of the effects of individual electoral registration has been a reduction in the completeness of the electoral register. Research shows that young people and students in particular were negatively affected. Indeed, according to the Electoral Reform Society, there are 9.4 million people across the UK missing from the electoral roll, nearly 14% of the UK's population. And whilst the process of individual electoral registration remains currently a reserved matter, that should not deter discussions on how to improve voter registration in the interests of democracy. In the run-up to the 2014 referendum, I recall attending a meeting in Edinburgh City Chambers with Mary Pickathley, who was the Chief Accounting Officer for the Scottish Independence referendum. And I was there as an employee of Education Scotland at the time, and I'm sure I'm not breaking any confidences when I say that it became clear the varying approaches across the country to Section 26 of the Scottish Independence Referendum Act 2013, which focus on encouraging participation. So Adam Tompkins is absolutely right when he says that we need to learn lessons from referendums, and perhaps the government can reflect upon that and strengthen the provisions contained within Section 28 of the draft bill, which focuses on that participation. The Electoral Management Board for Scotland advised the committee that rationalising existing laws to create a single, consistent framework governing referendums offers many benefits to the voter, to campaigners, the regulator and electoral administrators, and to the extent that the draft Referendum Scotland Bill contributes to this objective, the EMB see this as a wholly positive policy direction. And I hope members would agree with this in the interest of democracy. It is particularly important that young people are encouraged to register, as we know the impact of individual registration has already impacted negatively upon this cohort. Presiding Officer, I want to take issue with some of the evidence the committee received from the Stevenson Trust for Scotland. The Trust notes the gaps in the availability of modern studies programmes across Scotland, the lack of clarity about the aims and acceptable approaches in dealing with political questions and political literacy in the classroom. Modern Studies, Presiding Officer, is not a programme. It is a core part of the social studies curriculum area, which every pupil in Scotland should have experience of until the end of the broad general education, where they may choose to study it in further detail at National 4, 5, higher or advanced higher level respectively. The Trust then go on to reference their own research, which polled just 21 schools. That's not even 6% of Scotland's secondary schools. Yes, I will. Neil Findlay.
Like the member, I was a modern studies teacher also. Does she recognise that many schools don't teach modern studies at that level?
Jenny Gilruth.
I thank Neil Findlay for that intervention. When he talks about that level, I'm not quite sure what he's referring to. Higher than, sorry.
You can't just have a wee conversation across.
I'm going to come on to
Mr Findlay may wish to intervene again, but I do like to earn my keep. Mr Findlay, do you wish to clarify your intervention?
The point I was making that not all schools teach modern studies at a senior level.
Ms Gilruth.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think I'm coming on to address that point right now, actually. There is some evidence to substantiate the point, because the 2012 Social Studies Curriculum Impact Report, which was published, identified that 20% of Scotland's secondary schools did not deliver modern studies via a subject specialist. So they might deliver it, for example, with a history or a geographer up to a certain level. But that is important. Mr Findlay is correct if we have another referendum, because the proposed franchise will be based on that used for local government and for Scottish Parliament elections, which includes, of course, EU citizens and 16 and 17-year-olds. And I hope that this is an issue that the Education Committee can pick up as this legislation progresses, because we need to ensure that the next generation get the knowledge and the understanding and skills that modern studies develops to allow them to identify bias and exaggeration, for example, and to make an informed choice when they vote. And in an era of fake news, the pivotal role of modern studies in doing this has become even more apparent. The policy objectives of the bill are to ensure that future referendums on matters that are within the competence of the Scottish Parliament maintain the high standards achieved by the referendum on Scottish independence in 2014. 2014 is often lauded as the gold standard of referenda. There was mostly consensual debate, there was discussion, there was a white paper, like it or not, and up and down the country, whether you were yes or whether you were no, people became engaged in the political process in their droves, and we secured one of the highest ever, I think it was actually the highest ever voting turnout in the British Isles, with 84.5% of those eligible voting. We need to consider, only consider the position of Catalonia to reflect upon why exactly this legislation is so vitally important. Whether you were yes or no in 2014, no honest Democrat can accept the political persecution of those who support Catalonian independence as just. The former Vice President of Catalonia sentenced to 13 years in prison. The former Speaker of the Catalan Parliament sentenced
I'm getting an uneasy feeling. You know what I mean? Go back to the bill. Yeah, well, go back to the bill then. I'm trying to be subtle.
Well, with due respect, Presiding Officer, it links to the importance of why this question and why this debate we're having today is so important. And in Catalonia, obviously, there were a number of issues which didn't allow the democratic process perhaps to prevail in the way that it should have done. So as we watch on at will I move away from that point, Presiding Officer?
Oh, I think I'm weary. Just
okay,
continue.
Right. As we watch on at the horrific actions then of the Spanish government, we must make doubly sure to tread a path of civility in our use of language and our actions in this Parliament in the face of the next Scottish independence referendum. Presiding Officer, I spent my entire career in education trying to get young people interested in politics. They enjoyed watching Annabel Goldie dangle from an abseil in 2007. They were mildly amused by the Tories, brown bottles at stunt, but it was 2014 which engaged a generation of voters for the very first time. So let's make sure we get it right for the next generation. Let's make sure that they are the next part of Scotland's story. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. Now, who am I asking? I'm calling Graham Simpson, followed by John Mason. Mr Simpson, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. It is good to be able to talk in this debate on the Referendums Scotland Bill, and I will talk about the Referendums Scotland Bill. On the face of it, this bill looks perfectly innocent, Deputy Presiding Officer. An act of the Scottish Parliament to make provision for the holding of referendums throughout Scotland, to make provision about such referendums and other referendums held under the Acts of the Scottish Parliament, complete with sections on the franchise, conduct, campaign rules, agents, registration, etc. Doesn't ring any alarm bells. But there are all kinds of bear traps in there lurking for the unwary, and some sharp-eyed souls spotted them immediately. Deputy Presiding Officer, for accuracy purposes, this bill should be renamed the Independence Referendum, brackets, Preparedness for, brackets, Cranking Up Grievance, brackets, Scotland Bill. For that is what it is. Now, two committees of this Parliament have raised serious concerns on the back of evidence received. The DPLR Committee, which I convene, and the lead committee, Finance and Constitution, have both done an admirable job of scrutiny. They listened to the evidence, for example, on the preposterous idea that any future referendum on any subject would be set up using subordinate legislation. The Law Society of Scotland said, we have reservations about the use of subordinate legislation for the most important questions relating to the Constitution. What could they mean? Such issues require full and proper scrutiny, they said, which subordinate legislation does not provide. The Faculty of Advocates said, disregarding the issues about legislative competence, it is difficult to envisage circumstances in which the holding of such a referendum and the framing of the question to be put would be more appropriately initiated under secondary legislation than by the Scottish Parliament considering and debating a bill. And Dr. Alan Rennick, already quoted earlier, said, a power to call a referendum on any subject by regulations would be highly unusual. In fact, I've found no well-functioning parliamentary democracy that gives ministers blanket authority to call a referendum by secondary legislation. I myself did some research on this, and I can find no examples anywhere, not just well-functioning parliamentary democracies. This will be a world first, Presiding Officer, and not one to be proud of. I don't speak for the DPLR committee in this debate, but when we had Mr. Russell before us, I opened the questioning, and he and I danced around the subject of what a referendum might be used for. I suggested, perhaps rather cheekily, there might be a vote on bin collections. Not such a bad idea, given the state of service in some parts of the country. The Cabinet Secretary was, to be fair, less combative than usual, and when we discussed where primary legislation may be appropriate, he proffered moral issues like, say, end-of-life questions. But we all know that this bill is not about bin collections or moral questions. It's about one thing and one thing only, and that's independence. And to suggest the details of another vote on Scotland's constitutional future, which we decided on in 2014, should be rammed through Parliament by subordinate legislation is an outrage. The DPLR committee said in its Stage 1 report there may be times where using delegated powers is appropriate, but that different referendums may require a different level of parliamentary scrutiny, either primary or secondary legislation. The committee concluded that a question put in a referendum which requires an order made under delegated power in Section 30 of the Scotland Act, as well as questions about significant moral issues, should require primary legislation. And the Finance and Constitution Committee agreed with this. And then we come to the question of who sets a question. And let's be honest again, this is about independence. Section 3(7) excludes consideration of a question by the Electoral Commission, where they've previously published a report on the question or have previously recommended the wording of a question. Now, the Cabinet Secretary was rather bullish in a polite way about this in committee, claiming somewhat bizarrely that because we had asked one question in 2014, the same question should be set in stone, because in his words, it is a current question. He went on, I cannot see why we would suddenly decide we'd better brush this one down and have it tested again. It's still there, he said. It's still been asked. It's current. In effect, he wants to cut out the Electoral Commission. But this anti-democratic ruse was seen through straight away. Mr. Russell was rumbled. And that led to Mr. Crawford's committee saying that the evidence was in favour of the Electoral Commission testing a previously used referendum question, and that Mr. Russell must come to an agreement with them prior to stage 2. And I'm pleased to hear today that he's rather reined back on his rhetoric. Now, I said earlier in an intervention to Mr. Rumbles that this bill was being rushed through. That is my view. The government wants to push this through before the end of the year. I think this is a serious bill. There may be a number of amendments, and my view is there simply isn't time for that. If we're going to put through legislation like this, it needs to be done properly and not rushed.
Thank you very much. I now call John Mason to be followed by Neil Bibby. Mr. Mason, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to take part in this debate today. I have to say I joined the Finance and Constitution Committee after the summer, and therefore shortly after they had commenced their work on this bill. Although it is quite a technical piece of legislation, it certainly has created a lot of interest, and it does deal with many factors as well as the actual question of the wording of any question. Firstly, I think there is widespread agreement that there should be such framework legislation, so we do not need to keep reinventing the wheel every time we have a referendum. In the past, I myself have felt that we should move towards having more referenda on more topics, as they do in countries like Switzerland and the United States. We have tended to have referenda on major constitutional questions. For example, the first time I voted was in 1975 in the then European referendum. However, some have felt we should also have referenda on major moral questions, such as they have had on abortion in Ireland. But potentially we could also use them for local issues, as I think happened from memory in the 1996 decision when Rutherglen left Glasgow. However, I have to say that the 2016 referendum has made me a little more wary of this form of decision-making. If you get a big majority, such as in 1975 or 1997, I believe a referendum can give public endorsement to politicians' proposals. However, a close or disputed referendum, such as 1979, 2014 and 2016, clearly does not lead to widespread acceptance and may just lead to demands for a further opportunity to vote. Yes?
Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. I'm grateful to the member for giving way. Can I just point out that in '97 there was also a referendum in Wales which did lead to an extremely close, knife-edge result, and that actually it's the form of leadership by those who are on the winning side, reaching out and trying to implement in a way that brings people together. That's what creates the sense of being able to move on beyond a knife-edge result. And that's what has been failed in relation to the 2016 referendum, a sense of winner takes all.
John Mason.
Yes, I think that is a good point, because Wales has built on what was a very close result in 1997, and I think, having spent my summer holiday there this summer, I think there's a lot of agreement in support of Welsh devolution. Not quite at this moment, just let me progress. It raises the whole question of who makes decisions for a country, Parliament as representatives of the people, or the people themselves by way of a referendum. In England, the tradition is sovereignty of the Crown or Parliament, whereas in Scotland we would emphasise the sovereignty of the people. It seems to me that if we're to have the people making such decisions, and I agree that that's what we should be aiming for, then we also have a responsibility to ensure that the public are well informed. And that happened, I think, to a large extent in 2014, when the Scottish public were well informed about independence and, almost as a byproduct, informed about the European Union. I believe that was one reason for the different results in 2016. The Scottish public were already well informed about the European Union, whereas it seems that in many parts of the rest of the UK, the public were not so well informed. Moving on to some specifics of the bill, the question of whether there should be primary or secondary legislation is required each time. Paragraph 30 was a bit of a compromise in the committee, and I think we would agree it was a bit clumsy in a sense. But the result is that the committee recommends that primary legislation is almost always required, always for constitutional issues, usually for other issues. On political literacy, paragraphs 90 to 94 focused especially on young people. The suggestion seems to be that school pupils doing modern studies generally have a good understanding of the issues, but that many other young people do not. And I take the point that Jenny Gilruth was making in her speech. But I guess the same could be said of the wider population, that clearly some people have a better understanding of issues than others. A linked theme is in paragraphs 169 to 172, when we considered whether there should be public funding for either side of the campaigns. I understand this has been used in Ireland, where a change in the constitution might require a referendum, but there is little public interest, and so the campaigns need a funding boost. But I think both the committee and myself felt that this had not been our experience in Scotland, where referenda generally have been contentious, have created a lot of interest, and the risk is that public funding might well lead to increased public suspicion of the whole process. On income and expenditure, it has always struck me as odd concerning what expenditure needs to be reported, and the fact that staffing costs can be omitted. One organisation I was involved in for the 2014 campaign spent a large part of its budget on staffing, but that did not have to be reported anywhere. Another area that is not reported are donations and assets before an organisation is registered. And again, this strikes me as odd. Paragraphs 151 to 154 ask the government to consider this. And on thresholds, paragraphs 73 to 80 consider whether referenda should have simple majorities or supermajorities, or a required percentage of the electorate, or a percentage of turnout. International evidence is against these extra requirements, as they are often open to misuse, for example, by encouraging people not to vote at all, and I support the committee view that we should stick to simple majorities. Having said that, our experience of 2014 and 16 tells us that winning 52-48 or 55-45 comes with challenges. We may need to win at least 60-40 and possibly 70-30 in any referendum if the decision is going to be widely accepted, as, for example, in 1997, the decision to have this Parliament was won by 74 to 26%. Therefore, my personal feeling is that sometimes it's possible, it's better, if it's possible, to wait a bit longer before holding a referendum so that we're more likely to get a strong endorsement one way or the other. Finally, on the issue of the actual question, the committee came up with a wording asking the Scottish Government and the Electoral Commission to come to an agreement, presumably with a bit of compromise on both sides. That is not how it was portrayed in much of the media, but that is why it was a unanimous report. We did not say it should or should not be tested again, we just called for an agreement. And I welcome the Electoral Commission's latest briefing saying they would welcome any constructive discussions. Personally, I do not care too much exactly what the wording of the question is,
must come to a close,
nor do I
please.
care too much about the timing. I just want us to win the next independence referendum, I want us to win it well, and I want Scotland to be free again. Thank you.
Neil Bibby, followed by Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Finance and Constitution Committee have produced a balanced and fair analysis of this bill and issued a set of reasonable recommendations. It is now for the Parliament to decide whether or not the bill really is desirable. I agree with Bruce Crawford that we should aim for consensus in our politics, but as we have seen over the last few years, presenting a binary choice as the solution to complex problems can cause real difficulty in a modern parliamentary democracy. It can feed a political reductionism that polarises and drives people apart, instead of establishing consensus around a solution. I have no hesitation in saying I support a final say referendum on the issue of Brexit, but I only support a confirmatory EU referendum because it is a vehicle to confront the problems created by the last. A referendum is a relatively rare part of the democratic process, especially in this country. They do have a role, but as others have said, we must learn the lessons of recent times and the fractious politics they have created. Enhancing and reinvigorating the political process in a parliamentary democracy, giving people a real say over their future, is about so much more than a single event. Electoral reform of the House of Commons and replacing the unelected House of Lords to make our representative democracy more representative, an end to the creeping centralisation that undermines and marginalises local government. As others have said, witnesses to the committee recognise there is place for a generic framework governing referendums. However, in key areas, the committee found no support for the government whatsoever, particularly on the issue of question testing. The testing of referendum questions by the Independent Electoral Commission should be automatic in every case as a matter of principle. If that does not happen, it would undermine public confidence and the legitimacy of any potential referendum process. The Electoral Commission provides objectivity and impartiality. It should be the safeguard which gives the public reassurance that elections and referendums are fair, properly conducted, and that the results can be trusted. Professor Fisher, Professor Chris Carman, Dr Rennick, Dr Andrew Mycock, Dr Toby James all supported testing of any question. The Minister argued that because the Electoral Commission once approved the wording of a particular question in a particular referendum, that the same question should be used forevermore, that the Electoral Commission testing is somehow irrelevant in those cases, and I'm pleased the Minister is moving away from that position today. Because Dr Alan Rennick said that that would be a retrograde step, Dr Andrew Mycock has said that it is appropriate for every referendum if it is repeating an issue or if the material circumstances have changed to go through that process. Given the Scottish Government tell us they support a second independence referendum now, precisely because material circumstances have changed, they cannot have it both ways. The Scottish Government tell us this bill is about any referendum the Parliament wants to put to the people, but let's not kid ourselves. There is only one referendum the SNP want us to agree to, and it's the second independence referendum. The bill in its present form does not cover and cannot cover without a Section 30 agreement. In the same way David Cameron called a Brexit referendum to deal with divisions in the Tory party, it is clear that Nicola Sturgeon is using this bill to keep the nationalist grassroots happy. For the record, I do not support a second independence referendum. The Labour Party voted against the second independence referendum in this Parliament, and as Richard Leonard has made clear, we will do so again if necessary. But whether this bill is about independence or not, it is flawed. Throughout the committee scrutiny, witnesses raised concerns about how any future referendum would be scrutinised. Use of regulation minimises public participation and weakens the ability of this Parliament to interrogate issues and hold ministers to account. In his evidence, Dr Rennick said, a decision to have a referendum is a major decision, so it should be subject to the greatest level of scrutiny in the representative system. Using regulations as proposed instead of private legislation weakens scrutiny. The committee heard from no one outside of the Scottish Government who is prepared to justify the use of these regulations. The nearest anyone came to offering support was the Law Society, who said scrutiny should take the form of an act, or at least a Scottish statutory instrument that is subject to the super-affirmative procedure. But that would be a very suboptimal position. When it comes to a referendum, I believe primary legislation should be used in all cases. There are other areas which need to be addressed: imprints on digital campaign material, the Election Commission's powers to obtain information, better reporting of campaign spending and assets. And on that, I think Patrick Harvey made a number of very valid points. But as Alec Rowley said, the people of Scotland and the people of the UK have not been well served by years of constant constitutional wrangling, and I think they're fed up of it. They are tired of the UK Parliament consumed with debates about nothing but Brexit. They are tired of this Parliament, and specifically this government's obsession with independence. And today is a perfect example of why we should be debating other issues. As Neil Findlay said, this bill does nothing to improve people's lives. Education standards are falling, the NHS faces a workforce crisis, local services are suffering from chronic underfunding. It's time for this government to get back to what really matters. Brexit is a big mistake. It's a warning about the profound challenges, costs and complexities of breaking up institutions which are so fundamental to how we are governed. Scotland should avoid making the same mistake by leaving the UK. Independence is not an alternative to Brexit, it is an equivalent, one that would be even worse for the Scottish economy. So, Presiding Officer, in conclusion, the concept of a generic framework for referendums may be sound, but what this is really about is one referendum and one referendum only. There are fundamental flaws in this bill. We will not support another independence referendum. We will not support a rigged process, and we do not believe this bill should proceed.
Colin Beattie, followed by Donald Cameron.
Presiding Officer, I am pleased to have the opportunity to speak in this debate on the Referendum Scotland Bill. The first thing I would like to emphasise is that this is not simply a bill that's focused on another independence referendum, although I'm well aware this is exactly what some members may focus on solely. This is a bill which would allow for a strong framework for future referendums in Scotland of any nature. Although it would provide us with the power to allow referendums to be held in Scotland, it also gives us a chance to format rules, questions and legislation that are strong, well-intentioned and that hold our Parliament to account. We have an opportunity to put in place a robust structure which will provide the people of Scotland with a high standard for future referenda. We could avoid the catastrophic shambles of a distorted and divisive referendum of a similar nature to that of Brexit. In the Brexit referendum, we've done little but leave voters disengaged and disillusioned by the misinformation fed to them as a means to an end. The provisions for campaign rules within this bill are particularly prominent and would ensure that campaigns are both fair and transparent. We do not want to see more campaigns where incorrect information about the NHS is plastered on the sides of buses by self-seeking politicians. We need to re-engage the public with truthful... Of course.
Neil Findlay.
I think he's absolutely right about telling mistruths about the NHS. Do you remember what was said in the independence referendum, where it was said that if we do not vote yes, Scotland's NHS will be privatised?
Colin Beattie.
I think that that has no relevance to what I'm talking about in this bill, honestly. We need to re-engage the public with truthful, honest and fair politics, and enacting a bill that ensures comprehensive processes and open debate is a positive first step in making politics once more accessible and open. The Brexit advisory referendum, and yes, it was only advisory, clearly sets a precedent which we need to seriously consider when setting our own framework for referenda. Serious consideration has to be given as to how an advisory referendum became the settled will of the people of all of the United Kingdom. In actual fact, of course, it didn't reflect the views or wishes of the people of Scotland, and this has created a new impetus for the need to hold the appropriate powers within the Scottish Parliament for any future referenda. The residents of Scotland have a fundamentally different opinion on Brexit, but are being forced to submit to an alternative reality, although it's against their values and democratically expressed wishes. All this as a result of an advisory referendum, not a legally binding one. Surely the fact that the clear majority view of the Scottish people can so easily be disregarded is a cause for grave concern. Throughout the entire Brexit process, Scotland has been treated with contempt by Westminster. We voted overwhelmingly to stay in the EU. We've been ignored. Not only this, but our Parliament has been prevented from protecting the interests of the Scottish people. And we must not disempower our people by denying them the ability to make their own decisions on such life-changing matters, which is why it's so important that we support this bill. As we're all aware, the franchise was extended to include 16 and 17-year-olds for the independence referendum in 2014, and then, of course, for all Scottish elections following. The fact that these young people were denied a vote in the EU referendum in 2016 has left their voices unheard and has denied their access to democracy. In Scotland, various studies have concluded that 16 and 17-year-olds are perfectly capable of engagement and making informed decisions. Through this referendum bill, they would have a guarantee that they will not be excluded from decision-making, which is vital to their futures, as they were in 2016. Similarly, we need to secure the right for EU citizens to have the ability to exercise their democratic right. During this 2016 EU referendum, many of the experiences that they had were very unsatisfactory, and we need to ensure their rights are protected, and we need to make them feel welcome. We need provisions in place to guarantee that the mess around this in 2016 is not replicated, and I don't think we can trust Westminster to protect that right. Something which is a hallmark of the Scottish Parliament is that the structure of this establishment promotes and encourages cross-party collaboration. Rather than having a Parliament divided and paralysed by our differences in opinions, we can generally find areas where we can agree or find common ground. I think we would find it difficult to deny that currently we're operating with fundamentally different values than those which Westminster is currently exhibiting. And this bill gives us the power to draw on our abilities to work together across parties to scrutinise, debate and approve rules and procedures for future Scottish referenda. We can't simply wait and see what fate the UK government decides to impose on us when we already know that the Scottish people emphatically don't want Brexit. We're all too well aware that even in a best-case scenario, the people of this nation are going to be worse off. Morally, we have a duty to our people to ensure that we have some influence over that outcome, even if the Westminster regime seeks to thwart that democratic duty. Surely, as a result of this, there is a just cause for Scotland to have the power to ensure that our country has a say over huge constitutional and economic changes such as Brexit, that Scotland's views are heard and respected, especially when people overwhelmingly tell us they do not want something. We have a real opportunity here to ensure that the people of Scotland are presented with referenda which are built on a proper framework, which is well considered, carefully constructed and with legal standing. This is not about whether you want a second referendum on independence or on Brexit. It's about whether you believe that the people of Scotland deserve the right to something better than the desperate aftermath of Brexit, brought about as a result of deceit and flimsy legislative chicanery, that they have the right for their decision to be respected. It's been a long time since the UK has comprehensively reviewed the framework governing referendum. Surely for our Parliament to seek higher standards on such an important issue is more than reasonable. This bill has been welcomed by the Electoral Commission, the Electoral Management Board, the Faculty of Advocates and the Institute for Government. It's common sense that all of us in this Parliament should welcome this too. The people of Scotland whom we serve deserve no less.
Donald Cameron, followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Now, I normally would welcome the opportunity to speak in this chamber, especially on legislation and matters that will have a real and meaningful impact on the lives of the people we serve, as Colin Beattie just spoke about. But unfortunately, I cannot do that today, for this legislation does not address those concerns. I find myself here yet again talking about the Constitution, as I have done so often in this chamber since 2016. That is not to say these are unimportant issues, but when it comes to the priorities of this Parliament, we do a huge disservice to the people we represent by debating bills such as this at the current time. And Neil Finlay was right. How many of us have had constituents come to surgeries or had casework from people demanding a referendums bill forthwith? Precious few, if at all. We should, of course, be debating health and justice or the environment. We heard only yesterday how few debates there have been on education in government time. And when the First Minister states in this chamber and in her recent party conference speech that her top priorities are the education system and the NHS, yet we find ourselves spending valuable parliamentary time talking about the Constitution. How can we believe her? Yes.
Michael Russell. That is I respect the member's point of view. I disagree with it. But if that is true, how much more true would it be that an entire election campaign would be predicated on the Get Brexit Done slogan from the Prime Minister, and indeed the last 3 years at Westminster with no significant legislation because of Brexit? Does he not see that that is also, if he believes that is the problem, a major problem, and it's a Tory problem?
Donald Cameron.
That's a bit rich coming from a government that spent the first 18 months of this parliamentary session debating Brexit. But I acknowledge that in principle, a bill covering referendum legislation may be appropriate, but it's clear to us on these benches that this bill is simply a vehicle for this government to hold a second independence referendum and to try to frame it in the most favourable means possible for its own purposes. Even Mr Russell admitted to the Finance and Constitution Committee when he said, "We have never hidden the fact that I see this bill being used by Parliament and the government to create the referendum for independence." However, even putting that to one side, it is clear from today's debate that if this bill is to pass, there are many detailed issues that will need to be addressed at stage 2. And frankly, we see this bill for what it is and will not vote for it today. But if it does pass stage 1, we will work where we can to make sure that the bill puts power in the hands of Parliament and not ministers. The Law Society of Scotland have said that they were concerned that the bill will have the effect of reducing the time for parliamentary of public scrutiny of a future proposal for a referendum, and that as currently drafted, there is no requirement for parliamentary or public consultation, and draft regulations would not be amendable or subject to the level of scrutiny and accountability which should be applied to important or constitutional questions. And that's an understated but breathtaking criticism from a respected organisation of this bill as it stands, and further reinforces the impression that this government is attempting to bypass Parliament. One other point, I looked in vain for a provision which states that the government will respect the result of referendums. There was no sign of it in the bill. I wonder why, because the ultimate irony is that this government is putting through legislation on referendums when they have ignored the result of 2 referendums held in this country in the last 5 years. There are other concerns with this bill, which I will go into a bit more detail. They've been touched on by other members. And can I commend at this stage the Finance and Constitution Committee, and in particular Bruce Crawford, not just for their report, but for Bruce Crawford's typically measured speech today. But as others have noticed, the bill itself is faulty. The Institute for Government has said that as it stands, the bill would undermine the legitimacy of any referendum, a damning indictment. Specifically, the Institute for Government has noted that the lack of a requirement for the Electoral Commission to test a previously used referendum question as one of many reasons why this bill could have that effect. And on that point, this bill would diverge from normal precedent. In every UK referendum since the creation of the Electoral Commission, it has tested the proposed question to ensure it is comprehensible to voters and will not bias the outcome. And in addition to that, the Finance Committee report states that the Institutional Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance use the Electoral Commission's process for question testing as an example of good practice, and that the Independent Commission on Referendums, through the role of the Electoral Commission, has one of the most rigorous processes for assessing referendum questions. So my question to the Cabinet Secretary, and I mean this in all sincerity, is this: what is he so fearful of? This is an independent organisation that will test the question. And it gives me and these benches significant cause for concern as to why this provision exists in the bill in the first place, and we feel that it must be rectified to ensure that there is no partisan bias in setting such a question. Now, I was concerned, like others, about the extensive power this bill affords to ministers and attempts to reduce the role of Parliament. And the point has been made forcibly by others, but the question of primary legislation is incredibly important. This bill states that such actions in terms of setting referendums should be carried out by secondary legislation. And in the Finance Committee report, the Cabinet Secretary himself attempts to justify this by arguing that we should not see all referenda as the same. How can that be accepted? I do not accept it, nor it appears does the Finance Committee, who say that in terms of constitutional issues, referendums must require primary legislation and that all other referendums will ordinarily require primary legislation. Deputy Presiding Officer, it's clear to those of us on these benches that this bill is simply an attempt by this government to initiate a referendum on independence. It is a clear attempt to ram through that with no oversight or scrutiny, and one that gives ministers the means to mould the question in the best way to suit their outcomes. We will play no part in that today, and I urge others to do so too.
Stuart Stevenson, followed by Gil Patterson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And let me pick up almost the last words that we've just heard from Donald Cameron. No oversight or scrutiny when it's a piece of secondary legislation. This is unmitigated tosh, if such a word is allowed to be used here. And let me illustrate that by the current activities of the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Bill that is looking at the deposit return scheme, which is a scheme being introduced by secondary legislation. The committee and Parliament has decided there will be an extended period of consideration and a report produced by the committee. There will be evidence. It's exactly the process that you would have in scrutiny terms it's exactly the process, Mr. Rumbles, for scrutiny that you would have for primary legislation. Now, there is a difference between secondary... You refused me 3 times, please sit down. There is a difference between primary and secondary, which I readily acknowledge, that we can only accept or reject. That's decision-making difference, not scrutiny difference. And I think members should take account of that. And I was very surprised in Adam Tompkins' opening remarks to say that Parliament could not debate secondary legislation. Someone of his experience and educational background should know better. Now, I will say that, of course, I've been involved in politics a lot longer than him. In fact, I participated in 3 parliamentary elections before he was born. And I'm now going to draw on some of that experience to look at the detail that's before us, because this is about the detail of the bill. Looking at the functions of Chief Accounting Officers, Section 9, brackets 4, I think it would be useful, Mr Russell, the Government, if we also gave the number of ballot papers that were issued. And that is something that political parties know, but the public doesn't. So I think we might have a wee think about that. At paragraph 10(3)(d), a person providing goods or services to the accounting officer, I think we might also look at whether we should include providing services to someone who wishes to vote. In other words, if public transport failure means someone can't get to the polling station, it's of a similar character. I only think we should look at them. Looking at campaign rules at section 13, which is about the conduct of campaigning and restricting the publication of certain material. I think we need to be careful to consider what rules might apply to those who are not directly involved in a referendum and might be seeking to influence its outcome. I think of newspaper articles and newspapers. Looking at section 16, which is about the destruction, concealment, alteration of documents. Now, I relate that to Schedule 2, paragraph 38(1), where the ballot papers have to be retained for a year. But there is no such provision in relation to the materials that a campaigner might have to say how long the material should be retained. I think one of the problems with previous referendums is the campaigns fold up and disappear quite rapidly after the result is declared. And I think there is a case for saying that the materials they produce should be retained for a specified time. I don't say how long, but if it's a year for the ballot papers, I suspect that gives us an insight. I think further at 20, attendance at Electoral Commission proceedings and so on, and at section 21 and 22, there isn't a direct provision for the attendance of international observers at referendums. And I think we generally would accept that that is something that is part of good practice. Now, I'm not saying that the bill as constructed prohibits that. I think there are ways that it can be done. At 24C, person appointed by the Electoral Commission for the purposes, But that kind of conflicts with Schedule 2(15)(2), where the presiding officers also have power, and they're the people in the polling stations. I'll come back to some of the things they have. Some of them are slightly odd, I have to say. Yes, in fact, I'll come to it now. The presiding officers can decide who's admitted to a polling station without restriction. Which seems a very broad thing, and you may get different decisions made in different polling stations, and I think that's unhelpful to the integrity of any vote, whether on referendum or another subject. On the casting of votes, I think a legislation of this kind might sensibly at least provide provision for future bringing forward by secondary legislation, that's a subject we could debate, of electronic voting as an additional means of voting. The bill as tabled is silent that. And then at Schedule 2, the hours of polling are between 7 and 10 p.m. I think it's time to think, for major things like this, whether polling should not take place over 3 days between Thursday, Friday and Saturday. Because I think if we make big decisions, they should be made by the maximum number of people. I think there's also an issue about ballot boxes. We should ensure that ballot boxes, there's a minimum number of votes should go in a ballot box. Because I know of a ballot box that only gets 4 votes in it. So when it's tipped out, the secrecy of the ballot is compromised. Let me conclude, Presiding Officer, as you indicate I should do. There have been local authority referendums before, Strathclyde Water, Edinburgh Road charging would be examples. I think these are referenda that would have been referendums, oh dear, referenda, that would have benefited from a structure such as this. as indeed with the 1934-35 peace referendum, which was on whether the UK should stay in the League of Nations. I realise even I was not around then, although some might suggest. And finally, Presiding Officer, may I counsel my colleagues, the word referenda is not the plural of referendums, which is a fourth declension noun. Referenda means something altogether different and is a plural gerundive.
Every day is a learning day. And we move to the last contributor in the open debate, and that's Gil Patterson.
Many thanks, Presiding Officer. I'm really pleased to be speaking in this debate today, although I'm not a member of the committee. I think it's very timely that we're debating this today and that we're bringing forward the Referendum Scotland's bill, because I think it's quite clear from talking to people, ordinary people, that trust in referendum has actually been shaken somewhat by Brexit. Now, I'm not here to knock Brexit, whether you're in favour or against it. I really want to talk about the process and how things may have been a bit different about it. Although it's the referendums has been referendums themselves now, I fear, have been discredited. Things could have, the process could have been somewhat different. And the fact that there was a non-binding question utilised that actually became binding was the first breach of confidence. And the fact that really there shouldn't have been one question. When you consider that questions like whether or not we would be remaining with a vote if we could stay in the customs union or be in favour of the single market, then I feel that there should have been 3 questions at least for the people to consider. Now, if that had happened, in my view, that what had happened at Westminster and the time it has taken over 3 years to arrive at really in a bad place, then if these questions had been put in place in the first instance, then I think it would have been a whole different picture that would have emerged. And that I do believe that the process would have been finished by this time, because the rancour in the argument was not based on whether we should leave or not. That was a decision that the people understood, and the people made a decision. But the fact was that there was the parts remaining after that was where the argument really came into play. That kind of upset me because, I've looked at referendum in other places, and as John Mason has already indicated, it's a major tool in a lot of democracies throughout Europe and in Ireland now. And it's used in a very, very positive manner. It's used to consult a whole range of different issues, and it's used to engage with the public, and the public do engage. And at the same time, we give, in these countries, ownership is given to the public over very, very difficult issues. And it means the political classes like us, then if we give ownership to it, and when we're making these difficult decisions, then we can implement them much better. It's a much better tried and trusted way to go about your business. That being one of the biggest benefits. But of course, the other one is, that, and I would like to use this bill, that something that we don't do very well in this country is long-term planning, where, let's say, for instance, all the parties in here actually agree that the National Health Service is something very, very special. We all agree that, but we fight like cat and dog almost on a daily basis. We attack it, we point score, we talk about waiting times, ambulance shortages, and, I put my hand up, it's oppositions that do it, and if we were in opposition, guess what? We'd be doing the same thing. There's another way to do it by using a bill such as this. If we could all come together, say, in regards to the health service and come up with a 10-year plan that we all signed up to. And if we put that plan to the people, and if we ask the basic question, first of all, and I'm sure everybody would agree with this, do you agree with a public-funded National Health Service? Point one. Point two, you may go on to say, do you agree to pay a penny in the pound in tax? If we give a guarantee that we will spend every penny of that in the National Health Service. So it's not a one-question thing, it's maybe a 2 or 3 question if we do agree in the first place to sign up for a 10-year plan. Because basically, that's what happens in most small European countries, that the political classes get together, they agree on something fundamental to them where we all agree that something should happen, and there may be difficult situations that arise. So I see a bill such as this as a way to implement this, and for in the future that we look to do things somewhat different, and instead of taking something like the health service, which is so precious to us all and to the people, that we all get together, take ownership of it, talk to the people, come up with a resolution, and work to that 10-year plan. And in that way, we take it right out of politics. The health service shouldn't be, as far as I'm concerned, a political thing that we kick all the time. It's to the detriment of the service and the people that are in it. And I see this bill, I can understand my colleagues in the Conservative Party and elsewhere looking at the independence referendum. I'm looking well beyond this, to be quite honest, where we can make good use of a proper process within a referendum bill to make change for the better. Thank you.
We move to the closing speeches. And I call Alec Rowley for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In closing for Labour, I would like to reiterate why we will be voting against this bill today. Our reasons are twofold. First, the bill, as it currently stands, is not fit for purpose. As members have pointed out across the chamber, evidence to the committee was highly critical of a number of provisions in the bill, namely the granting of ministerial power to hold referendum by secondary legislation and the issue regarding the testing of any question by the Electoral Commission. I did almost use the term referenda there, but I was stand corrected by my colleague Stuart Stevenson. These issues alone, given how fundamentally flawed they are, would be enough for us not to support the bill. But on top of that is the fact that the entire bill has been phrased in the context of an independence referendum. I noted that Donald Cameron, when he talked about the priorities of the First Minister being education and health, that the Cabinet Secretary came in and intervened and talked about the fact that 3 years have gone by where in Westminster that time has been completely wasted and they've not been able to focus on the big issues. He was attacking the Tories for that, and rightly so. But the very point he makes is the very point I think that many people are making today. Where in Scotland is there a demand right now to bring forward legislation to create a referendum bill that will give us more referendums, more of the same type of problems that we did have? And it's a fair point, because it's a point Neil Findlay, I think, was trying to get across when he was saying that in parts of his constituency where you don't have GP practices anymore, where public services are in decline, then the issue is not let's have a referendum bill. The issue is let's fix our health service. Let's address the issues as to why our education service is going back the way and children are being denied the opportunities that they should have in education. I also, I think, picked up on the point that Alistair Burnett made, where he said about the pretense that this is not about independence. But as I said earlier, I think in fairness to the SNP have been very upfront and clear. This bill being brought forward is to pave the way for an independence referendum, not some time off in the future, but in the next year. And the reality of that is that I just don't believe, even those people who say they would support independence if there was a referendum, none of them are demanding that we have a referendum right in the middle of the absolute chaos that we're in as a result of a failed Tory
Michael Russell.
The central point here, which is in order to escape from Brexit, Scotland has to be able to choose its own constitutional future. That is the key point. Not just sitting and waiting for it to be done for us. That may be good enough for Labour. It's not good enough for Scotland.
Alex Rowley.
Also says that this is a way out of Brexit. It's not a way out of Brexit. This would create even further and greater chaos. Would we be in Europe? Would we be out of Europe? Would we have a hard border between Scotland and England? Would we not have a hard border between Scotland and England? Would we lose the biggest trading partner we have within a free market within the United Kingdom? So this is a recipe for even more chaos, and that's why Labour cannot possibly support this bill today. Indeed, I would urge the SNP to take this bill and take it back and think again. This is not in Scotland's interest. Ultimately, this bill is only about one referendum. Nicola Sturgeon has made clear that it is being put in place to pave the way for an independence referendum within the lifetime of this Parliament. And I say again, what would be, well, you say, yeah. What would be the proposition in Europe, independence within Europe, where the European Union and European countries tell us what the rules will be and whether we have a hard border or not. Not £12 million of trade at risk, but £50 million of trade at risk. That's the reality of this bill, Presiding Officer, and that's why the SNP must think again, reject this bill, take it back, and let's start fighting for the issues that will change people's lives in Scotland.
That was very quickly all gone silent. Murdo Fraser, 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. So I suppose first question to address is what exactly is this debate about? Because we've heard lots of different interpretations on different sides of the chamber. We can't really take a view on the bill that we're being asked to vote on in a few moments until we can answer that question. And what the bill does is set out a framework for holding future referendums. Adam Tompkins set out at the start of this debate why we are right to be cynical about what exactly this seeks to achieve. Unlike in other jurisdictions, like, for example, Switzerland, there is no particular tradition of holding referendums in this country. Although Gil Patterson made, I thought, a very decent case as to why perhaps we should rethink that approach. But what we've done in our tradition is tend only to hold referendums when we have major constitutional questions to put, such as devolution in 1979, Scottish independence in 2014, or membership of the EU in 2016. And when the bill team came to the Finance and Constitution Committee and were asked whether there were any topics they had in mind to put to a referendum, other than the question of Scottish independence, they were unable to come up with any suggestions. So this our start. Yes, I'll give way.
Mike Crumbles.
Would you agree with me that this is clearly a partisan bill? Because at decision time tonight, it's only the two nationalist parties and MSPs from the two nationalist parties that are going to be voting for it.
Murdo Fraser.
Yeah, I think my friend Mr. Rumbles may well be right. We will see the two nationalist parties in this chamber combining together because they know what this bill is really about. It's all about independence. And indeed, as Adam Tompkins reminded us, Mr. Russell told the committee on the 25th of September, and I quote, "We've never hidden the fact that I see this bill being used by the Parliament and the government to create the referendum for independence." And that's been quite clear in this debate, because on different sides we heard from Alec Rowley, and then we heard from Angela Constance on different sides, people arguing the substance of the case for and against independence. So that basic knowledge of what we're actually talking about in this bill has to influence our approach to this legislation. But beyond that, there are very serious flaws in what is being presented, which means we're being asked to vote upon what is simply bad law. And there are two key issues where this bill is flawed. The first is in relation to the power given to Scottish ministers to call referendums by means of secondary legislation, an approach slammed by witnesses. The Institute of Government said in their evidence that the bill would undermine the legitimacy of any referendum. They said it is imperative that the Scottish Government avoid the perception that it is seeking to avoid full scrutiny of a referendum proposal by intention or as the consequence of a desire to fast-track the process. And these views were echoed by Alan Renwick, already quoted in this debate, who said, "I have found no well-functioning parliamentary democracy that gives ministers blanket authority to call a referendum by secondary legislation." The Faculty of Advocates and the Law Society of Scotland took a similar view. Graham Simpson, the convener of the Parliament's Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee, reminded us that that committee said that constitutional referendums should require primary legislation, a view that was echoed by the Finance and Constitution Committee. Now, I was pleased to hear the Cabinet Secretary accept now that a constitutional referendum wouldn't need primary legislation. In his words, a short bill. A short bill. Well, I hope that's not an attempt to avoid detailed parliamentary scrutiny should we ever get to that stage, presiding officer, because it sounds to me the use of the word a short bill means just that. And the second issue where this legislation was found wanting is in relation to the testing of the referendum questions. And the committee, the Finance and Constitution Committee, heard a great deal of evidence on this issue. The Electoral Commission were very clear in their view that any question that was being asked had to be properly tested by them, even if it had been asked previously. This was because, in their view, context can change. So the ambition of Scottish ministers that a question that has been asked before should not be retested is simply not supported by the evidence. And this is very important in the context of a potential future independence referendum, because we now know, in the light of experience, that in any referendum where a yes-no question is asked, those on the yes side have an inbuilt advantage from day one. Because yes is a positive, affirming word, it is easier to get people to agree to a proposition than to disagree. And it's for precisely that reason, presiding officer, that the 2016 referendum didn't ask a yes-no question. The question was framed around leave and remain. So views on this issue have changed since 2014. I'll give away in a second. And that is the reason the role of the Electoral Commission in determining any question being asked is absolutely vital. I'll give way to Mr Crawford.
Bruce Crawford.
Given that I'm speaking as the convener at this stage, I'll make this a question of fact. Did Murdo Fraser think that the Electoral Commission for the referendum in 2014 get it wrong?
Murdo Fraser.
Well, time has moved on. We're 5 years on from 2014. We have more experience of referendums. We have no experience of the testing of questions. And in 2016, they didn't agree a yes-no question at that particular point. So what we see, therefore, in this bill is an attempt by the SNP government to gerrymander any future referendum, to rig the terms of it so it's as favourable to their cause as possible. And that is simply not acceptable. It should not be acceptable to this Parliament, and it's not acceptable to anyone taking an objective view on how referendums should be run. Let me deal very briefly with one other matter considered by the bill, the question of thresholds. And I listened with great interest to the case that John Mason said for referendum thresholds being higher than 50% plus one, which has been the historic trend. And I've heard the case often made. It seems bizarre that when you want to change the constitution of a voluntary society or a golf club, a two-thirds majority is required, but we can change the constitution of a country simply on 50% plus one. And I can see the attractions in that argument, but there is no precedent for any threshold more than 50% plus one being used. So I don't think we should rule that out, but creating a different threshold might simply create more problems than it solves. Presiding officer, in conclusion, while this... Well, I'm in my last
Mr.
10
Fraser's
seconds.
just closing.
10 seconds. While this bill may appear to be about referendums in general, we know in practice it is about just one issue, independence. And even in that respect, this bill is fundamentally flawed. It seeks to give substantial power to Scottish ministers to bypass Parliament, to grab power for themselves, and in particular it gives them the power to set the question in any referendum without proper scrutiny. These measures are unacceptable to us, and they should be unacceptable to this Parliament. Presiding Officer, we don't want another independence referendum. We do not believe the public want another referendum. But even if we did, this bill does not represent a suitable vehicle to take that forward. For these reasons, Parliament should reject it at decision time tonight.
Call on Michael Russell. 9 minutes should take us to decision time, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And what an unusual debate this has been. If you just stand back from this debate for a moment and consider what's been taking place this afternoon, we have been debating as a Parliament a committee report, which I have already welcomed and strongly welcomed, and welcomed the work of the other committee contributing to the Delegated Powers Committee, which unanimously approved the policy objectives of the bill. And then when the issue is debated, 2 of the 4 parties of the committee denounce the bill and say they can have nothing to do with it, indeed denounced in ringing terms by the Tory spokesperson, who is the vice convener of that committee. And moreover, it is in the circumstances in which, in my opening statement, I made it clear that I accepted virtually all the recommendations that the committee, made, including the most contentious one, where I have said I will do exactly what the committee has asked me to do, which is to go and seek agreement with the Electoral Commission. I've said I will do that. So what an extraordinary afternoon. And what it proves is that this isn't about this bill. And that's been absolutely clear. Well, I was actually about to quote Professor Tompkins on that, but I think his own laughter does it. Mr. Tompkins said this wasn't about the bill, and he was absolutely correct. This is about the view from some parties in this Parliament that they have a contempt for the democratic views of the Scottish people, and they will never allow them to be heard. And let me prove that. No, I will not. No, I'm sorry. I have a lot to get through, and I did take an intervention from you earlier, and a lot of good it did me. So I'm just not bothering again. Right. Let me just prove this point by reference to 2 Tory speeches this afternoon. Mr. Burnett made a speech that was an absolute tearjerker, I have to say. It was absolutely extraordinary defence of the Electoral Commission in everything that it did. It needed to be protected and respected, although I had indicated in my opening speech that I accepted all their recommendations. But I had to say it needs to be protected and respected. It's outrageous that there should even be minor disagreement with the Electoral Commission. Well, there was sage nodding of heads on the Tory benches. This was absolutely correct. Of course, Mr. Burnett was speaking sense on behalf of every Tory. Except it's just not true in terms of the Tory party. These are the words of Alan Mabbutt. You could say, who is Alan Mabbutt? Alan Mabbutt is the Director General of the Conservative Party. He gave evidence to the Commons PACAC Committee in June this year. He said, and I'm paraphrasing it, but it's from a news report, he did not support strengthening the Electoral Commission. He went on to heavily criticise its performance. He attacked it for handing out unfair fines. He said it had taken the wrong tone with the parties and given deficient advice on electoral law. So I'm afraid that Mr. Burnett's view is not shared by the Conservative Party. I doubt even if it's shared by Mr. Burnett. It's an excuse to attack the SNP. It's nothing to do with the Electoral Commission. It's crocodile tears from Mr. Burnett. But of course, there was even an even more dramatic moment with Mr. Tompkins earlier on. I was hearing Mr. Tompkins telling the chamber in passionate tones how he was a strong defender of democracy, that he was a Democrat here, and it was the SNP that was outrageously defeating democracy. At the same time, Louis Brooks, the Guardian correspondent covering Boris Johnson's visit, was tweeting this. Boris Johnson tells reporters in Murray that he will not grant the powers for a second independence referendum regardless of whether the SNP wins a majority of seats in this election or or wins a pro-independence Holyrood majority in 2021. How is that for democracy? It doesn't matter how the people of Scotland vote, we will just ignore them. Now, both of those things illustrate the truth of the Tory contribution to this. It is entirely bogus, completely and utterly bogus, as is the attack on the question of the question. Because the question in the 2014 referendum is in current use. It's been used in over 50 opinion polls. It is absolutely clearly supported. 77% of people in an opinion poll show that it believes it should be used again. Only 10% take the Burnett and Tompkins view. So this is completely bogus. And let's give you the last bit of evidence that proves it. Because the person who summed up for the Tories, of course, earlier on tweeted this: "Leave Remain and a two-thirds majority required. Bring it on." That was his views of the question. That's how he wanted the question to be. I'm afraid the Tory position is threadbare and bogus, full of sound and fury, and signifies absolutely nothing at all. All that the Tories are against the Scottish people having their say, and they will use any excuse to push that issue. I have to say also, the other speech I want to mention is Neil Findlay's. I do find it astonishing that Neil Findlay cannot make the connection, the clear, direct, inevitable connection between a political system that allows a Tory government to destroy the interests of Scotland and the poorest people of Scotland, a Tory government that's allowed to impose poverty and austerity, and the matter of the Constitution. Now, why can't Mr Findlay make that connection? Because if he did make that connection, he would have to accept that it is the constitutional choice that the Labour Party has made that has caused the poverty of Scotland, rather than alleviated the poverty of Scotland. I don't believe... No, I'm not taking Mr Findlay. I've had enough of him this afternoon. Quite enough of him. No, I'm not taking him. I don't believe that Mr... Unlike my view of the Tories, I don't believe that Mr Findlay's point is bogus, but I do believe Mr Findlay is blinkered. Let me now deal with one or two of the substantive points in terms of the legislation. On the issue of primary-secondary legislative split, I explained to both committees that I gave evidence to very carefully what this bill was. And this bill was constructed in a way that put all the arrangements, all the detailed arrangements for a referendum into one bill, and then made sure that the small number of things that change in individual referenda came in a separate process. That was entirely clear. But if the committee does not want to have that process as it is, then I am happy to say that we will have primary legislation. I said it in the opening of my speech. And if that is really one of the reasons, the key reasons, why Labour couldn't support, then they can support now, because I've made it absolutely clear. Indeed, the argument that they could not... No, I'm sorry, I'm not taking interventions, because I've got a lot to get through. It was a long debate. Mr Johnson was not here for the debate. I'm sorry. Throughout that whole process, I have been agreeable to change. If Labour was genuine about those changes, they should be supporting this bill. Can I also say on the question of Section 37, which has been objected to, dynamic legislation has been recommended for electoral legislation, because that means that you can continue to change as circumstances change. That is what electoral administrators will tell you is required, and we should be supporting it. Presiding Officer, I started by saying what an unusual debate this was, but this is also an unusual Parliament, and that was shown this afternoon. Because in a normal national Parliament, you would expect that there was an enthusiasm for enabling our voters to have their say. In a normal national Parliament, you accept... I don't think anybody in the Liberal Democrats should talk about trust, I have to say. In a normal national Parliament, you expect that there would be a keenness to have a debate about how we enhance democracy. And in a normal national Parliament, there would be an acceptance that a democratic choice of the nation's future would be what each and every member of that Parliament would vote for. And this afternoon has proved to me yet again that because this is not yet a normal national parliament. We should continue with the process of ensuring that we have a normal nation, and that is an independent nation. I commend the bill.
Thank you very much. And that concludes our Stage 1 debate on the Referendums Scotland Bill. The next item of business is consideration of motion 19539 on a financial resolution to the Referendums Scotland Bill. Could I invite Derek Mackay to move this motion? Thank you very much. So we're going to turn now to decision time. And there are two questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is that motion 19743 in the name of Michael Russell on Stage 1 of the Referendums Scotland Bill be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a division. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion 19743 in the name of Michael Russell is yes 65, no 55. There were no abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed. The second question is that motion 19539 in the name of Derek Mackay on a financial resolution to the Referendum Scotland Bill be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote and members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion 19539 in the name of Derek Mackay is yes 65, no 55. There were no abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed. And that concludes decision time. I close this meeting.